Bonjour à tous et à toutes et bienvenue donc à la conférence en ligne Henri V, Territoires d'histoire, territoires littéraires en guerre. Welcome everyone to our online conference on Henry V historical and literary territories of war. How to start really this conference? Effectivement, je me suis un peu demandé comment commencer cette conférence. Bienvenue à l'Eurovision 1415. Nous sommes à Toulouse et nous allons vous donner les scores. France, 0. England, 1 point. France, 0. Angleterre, 1 point. To all our non-francophone viewers, let me first speak French as we are the host country, and then I will switch to English. Donc c'est sur le mode de l'Eurovision que j'ai l'honneur d'ouvrir les débats de cet après-midi, organisés par le programme Diplomatica de l'unité de recherche culture anglo-saxonne de l'Université de Toulouse Jean Jaurès. Je suis heureuse d'accueillir nos intervenants venant des deux côtés de la Manche pour remonter sur la brèche d'Harfleur, arpenter les champs boueux d'Azincourt et signer une paix à trois. Bon, une paix pas bien longue. À l'heure où l'on discute ailleurs des relations entre le Royaume-Uni et l'Union européenne, nous allons explorer ensemble comment chroniqueurs, monarques, dramaturges ont vu et revu cet épisode de la guerre de Cent Ans, sorte de Brexit à l'envers. Nous voyagerons dans l'histoire, la géographie, la philosophie et évidemment le théâtre de William Shakespeare pour observer ce roi à l'héroïsme parfois douteux, Henri V, depuis Azincourt jusqu'au traité de Troyes dont nous célébrons les 600 ans cette année, et jusqu'à la scène théâtrale de la Renaissance. Je veux remercier vivement les participants d'être là aujourd'hui, ainsi que le public en ligne que nous ne pouvons voir. Et à la manière des acteurs de Shakespeare, je demande leur indulgence en cas d'avarie technique durant cette journée. L'après-midi donc est organisé en 3 ateliers. Nous entendrons chaque fois 2 intervenants à la suite, puis nous ouvrirons un temps de discussion. Vous pouvez poser vos questions donc dans les commentaires ou dans le chat de la chaîne YouTube que vous êtes en train de regarder, j'espère, ou m'envoyer des questions à l'adresse donc diplofab@gmail.com que vous pouvez voir apparaître dans la biographie de la chaîne YouTube. Nous ferons une courte pause aux alentours de 16h40, donc une courte pause de 10 minutes avant notre dernier atelier. C'est un territoire nouveau que l'Ethernet à conquérir et je demande donc indulgence et patience du public quand nos compétences numériques seront mises à l'épreuve. Nous, universitaires, faisons tous de notre mieux partout dans le monde. Mais trêve, il est temps de partir à la conquête de ces territoires d'histoire et drames historiques ensemble, unis dans notre diversité pour quelques heures. Let me actually now welcome our English-speaking colleagues and viewers. A warm welcome to all to this conference sponsored by Diplomatica, a research program of the Université Toulouse Jean Jaurès. Today we will go once more onto the breach of Harfleur, tread the muddy field of Agincourt and sign a peace treaty in Troy. While in Brussels, our representatives discuss the future relationship of the UK with the continent, we will explore from both sides of the channel this reverse Brexit that was the episode of the Battle of Agincourt. History, geography, philosophy, and of course, William Shakespeare theatre will help us understand King Henry V, his much discussed heroism, and the sometimes rocky, always close, and definitely interesting relationship between France and England. So the first panel is going to be in French and the 2 other panels will be in English. The Q&A will occur each time after the 2 speakers are finished for each panel. You can send questions by writing in the commentary section and chat on YouTube, and also by sending an email to diplofab@gmail.com. The address and the program of the conference are available in the About section of the YouTube channel. As Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream, I will humbly ask for your patience and clemency if we poor academics do sometimes offend with our digital skills. The Ethernet is a new territory to conquer, and we academics are trying valiantly at the moment everywhere in the world. But for now, let's conquer historical and literary territories together, united in our diversity for a few hours. J'ai l'honneur de maintenant céder la parole à mon collègue Daniel.
La parole à Frédéric Foissier. Alors, je dois reconnaître avec beaucoup d'humilité que je n'ai pas, avec vos travaux, la familiarité que je peux entretenir avec ceux de Valérie Toureille, parce que je suis médiéviste, je suis historien, qui plus est, je travaille sur la péninsule ibérique, donc cela ne me prédispose pas véritablement à vous lire, je vous prie de m'en excuser, mais je me suis un tout petit peu renseigné naturellement et j'ai vu beaucoup de choses passionnantes, en particulier des choses sur la médecine qui ont attiré mon attention, parce que historien de la guerre, à l'occasion, je regarde avec toujours intérêt ce qui s'écrit sur les pratiques médicales. Mais ce n'est pas de médecine que vous allez nous parler maintenant, vous allez nous parler d'Henri V encore, mais un autre Henri V, celui de Shakespeare. Donc, je vous cède la parole. Et je reprendrai tout à l'heure la suite des discussions pour les tours de questions. À vous, Frédéric Foissier, merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci beaucoup, Nathalie, de m'avoir invitée à cette journée. Je suis ravie d'y participer sur une pièce qui me tient beaucoup à cœur, que j'aime énormément. Donc, j'espère vous faire partager un peu de mon enthousiasme. Aujourd'hui, j'ai décidé de vous parler de la construction du récit historique dans la pièce, en parlant aussi au passage un petit peu d'historiographie à l'époque de Shakespeare pour mettre en place quelques repères. Voilà, donc ma communication s'intitule « Remember with Advantages, Henry V et la construction de la fiction historique ». Donc, la pièce historique est un genre protéiforme et hybride, né de la rencontre des chroniques, des récits historiques, en vers ou en prose de l'Antiquité et de l'Europe continentale, des pièces saintes médiévales, du folklore, des ballades, des romances, etc. À l'époque de Shakespeare, c'est un genre nouveau et en pleine expérimentation, un genre instable, mal déterminé, possédant des points communs avec les genres dramatiques préexistants, que ce soit la tragédie, dont on trouve beaucoup d'ingrédients dans Richard II ou Richard III, par exemple, ou la comédie, on pense aux scènes comiques avec les personnages populaires dans Henri IV, ou même à Henri V, qui se conclut par un mariage comme une comédie, finalement. Shakespeare est probablement l'auteur le plus étroitement associé à la représentation de l'histoire de l'Angleterre. Ces pièces historiques couvrent la période qui s'étend de 1399 à 1485, c'est-à-dire de la déposition de Richard II, qui ouvre la guerre des Roses, jusqu'à l'établissement de la nouvelle dynastie des Tudors. La concomitance entre l'essor de la pièce historique et l'émergence de la conscience nationale pourrait nous amener à considérer la pièce historique comme un genre patriotique, puisque le sens du passé est indispensable à la nation pour asseoir sa légitimité. Henri V est traditionnellement vu comme l'exemple le plus représentatif de la pièce historique anglaise au service de l'exaltation des sentiments patriotiques, voire de la propagande pour l'unité nationale. Pourtant, le positionnement idéologique des pièces historiques de Shakespeare ne va pas de soi, même pour, et j'ai même envie de dire, surtout pour, peut-être, Henri V. Ces textes ne se contentent pas de refléter une conscience émergente de l'identité nationale. Ils aident aussi à la construire et la soumettre à un examen critique. En ce sens, la pièce historique ne constitue pas tant un reflet de l'histoire qu'une réflexion sur l'histoire. Comme le souligne Michael Hathaway dans son introduction au Cambridge Companion to Shakespeare's History Plays, l'histoire n'est pas représentée dans un souci d'authenticité. Elle est déformée, réécrite, dans le but de livrer une réflexion sur les rouages du pouvoir et du jeu politique qui va au-delà des faits représentés et possède une portée plus large, plus universelle et moins ancrée dans le temps que ne peuvent l'être les chroniques, sources des pièces. Dans Henri V, Shakespeare livre une réflexion critique non seulement sur les failles de la construction du sentiment patriotique, mais aussi, de manière plus large, sur l'écriture de l'histoire en elle-même, notamment à travers l'insistance sur l'oubli, la reconstruction des souvenirs et les procédés à l'œuvre dans leur narration. Tout ceci donne à l'histoire une dimension nécessairement fictive, aspect renforcé par le médium du théâtre, qui met en exergue l'idée de représentation. Les textes historiques revêtent une multitude de formes à l'époque de Shakespeare. Chroniques, archives, poèmes épiques, inventaires, descriptions des monuments donnent naissance à des genres souvent hybrides où réalité et fiction cohabitent. De nombreux genres comme la poésie ou le théâtre, considérés aujourd'hui comme relevant de la fiction, étaient vus comme des genres historiques et les mots « story » et « history » étaient employés indifféremment. La dynastie des Tudors, ayant fraîchement accédé au trône d'Angleterre en 1485, après 30 ans de guerre civile, trouve dans l'histoire un moyen de légitimer son autorité. Au moment où la succession d'Élisabeth met à nouveau en avant le problème de la légitimité, l'histoire devient un enjeu national dans la préservation de la paix et le maintien de la stabilité politique. Le pouvoir en place favorise les approches comme celle de Holinshed dans ses chroniques. Le fait que ce dernier constitue la principale source de Shakespeare a conduit toute une école critique à faire une lecture providentialiste des pièces historiques. Théorie notamment développée par Tilliard dans Shakespeare's History Plays, paru en 1944. Et cette école lit les pièces comme une grande fresque morale de crime et d'expiation à la gloire de la nation qui aboutit à l'Angleterre d'Élisabeth. Ces critiques écrivent dans les années qui suivent la Seconde Guerre mondiale. J'y reviendrai peut-être. Ils avancent la théorie du mythe Tudor, qui voit dans les pièces historiques un moyen de célébrer les grands héros du passé et leurs actes de bravoure au nom de la patrie. Dans cette perspective, Henri V en particulier apparaît comme le paroxysme de la célébration de la nation et de son monarque. Selon cette approche, la déposition et le meurtre de Richard II constituent une sorte de péché originel dont Bolingbroke, le futur Henri IV, et ses descendants doivent payer les conséquences jusqu'à l'expiation effectuée par Henri V. Henri V incarnerait ainsi l'héroïsme perdu que tout le projet des deux tétralogies semble voué à retrouver. Néanmoins, une lecture attentive du texte montre que cette vision est très réductrice. Chez Shakespeare, la préoccupation pour les forces de la politique prend le pas sur la lecture théologique que l'on trouve dans les chroniques. Il montre la manière dont les hommes forgent leur destin et écrivent leur propre histoire, même si les conditions ne dépendent pas toujours d'eux. De plus, les textes de Shakespeare sont polyphoniques et s'ils donnent voix aux personnages représentant l'autorité qui légitiment leur pouvoir en invoquant la volonté divine, ils laissent aussi entendre des personnages plus subversifs qui font référence au bien commun, démystifient le pouvoir, désacralisent la monarchie ou dénoncent le lourd prix à payer pour l'héroïsme. Un autre argument qui s'oppose à l'idée selon laquelle Shakespeare aurait conçu ces deux tétralogies comme une fresque destinée à glorifier les Tudors et la nation est l'ordre de leur composition, inverse à l'ordre chronologique des événements dont elles traitent. Cet ordre est non pas linéaire, comme le voudrait un schéma providentiel classique allant de la damnation à la rédemption, mais circulaire. Il commence avec la mort d'Henri V, présentée dans Henri VI, et s'achève avec Henri V au sommet de sa gloire, bien que, là encore, cette approche soit à nuancer. Dans Shakespeare from the Margins, Patricia Parker analyse de manière fort éclairante l'ordre de composition des pièces historiques. Elle avance notamment que le bouleversement de l'ordre chronologique a pour effet de dénoncer l'importance de la généalogie et de la transmission mise en avant dans les pièces comme une pure production du discours, construite de manière rétroactive. Cette chronologie perturbée se pose à l'encontre du modèle de la chute et de la restauration de l'harmonie tel qu'avancé par les providentialistes. S'il est difficile de concevoir les pièces historiques de Shakespeare selon un schéma de rédemption sur le mode biblique, c'est avant tout parce qu'il y présente l'histoire comme une construction fictionnelle. Les pièces historiques mettent en scène des événements qui se sont produits en Angleterre au siècle précédant leur production, mais elles mènent également toute une réflexion sur ce qu'est l'histoire et la manière d'en rendre compte. Elles réfléchissent sur l'histoire plus qu'elles ne la reflètent. Une fois les événements accomplis, le passé s'évapore, il est irrécupérable. Le seul moyen de le préserver est de le raconter, ce qui permet aussi de se l'approprier, d'en faire sens et d'en donner sa propre interprétation. Dans une sorte de mise en abîme, Shakespeare dévoile, voire dénonce, les mécanismes à l'œuvre dans la construction du récit historique, tout en se livrant lui-même à l'exercice. Il nous montre la manière dont le passé est créé et recréé à l'infini selon une multiplicité de points de vue. Contrôler le récit historique revient à contrôler l'image que la postérité retiendra. De ce point de vue, le dramaturge et les personnages, et tout particulièrement Henri V, effectuent un travail d'écriture comparable. Les différents récits que les protagonistes nous donnent à entendre entrent souvent en conflit, et par là même remettent en question la démarche historiographique et la possibilité d'accéder à une quelconque vérité objective. Narration dans le présent de faits passés, l'histoire fait avant tout intervenir la mémoire, qu'elle soit rétrospective pour la récupération des faits passés ou prospective, puisque le récit des événements est également construit pour les fixer et les transmettre à la postérité. Shakespeare insiste sur la sélectivité et la créativité de la mémoire. Raconter le passé signifie obligatoirement, de manière consciente ou non, oblitérer certains éléments pour en privilégier d'autres, comme le souligne le chœur dans l'épilogue de Henri V. Je cite, « Thus far, with rough and all unable pen, our bending author has pursued the story in little room confining mighty men, mangling by starts the full course of their glory. » Pour que le passé devienne une fiction du présent, il doit d'abord être détruit, mutilé, mangling, et transformé en récit qui le défend. En l'absence de toute possibilité d'accéder au passé directement, nous sommes invités, à part le cœur, à participer à cet effort de reconstruction dans lequel l'imagination et la créativité jouent une si grande part. La réalité objective à la source du récit, et de la représentation historique existe, mais elle est hors d'atteinte. L'histoire est nécessairement une production, une création, une fiction. En outre, la narration rétrospective du passé se teinte des préoccupations contemporaines de ses auteurs et de ses destinataires qui projettent leur propre réalité dans le récit historique. Le récit historique construit une vérité qui n'existe pas au moment où les événements se produisent. Henri V possède une conscience aiguë de la possibilité de modeler le récit historique et de l'influence écrasante du passé sur le présent et l'avenir. Déterminé à soumettre les forces de l'histoire à sa volonté, il ne perd jamais de vue le récit rétrospectif qui sera fait de son règne et se pose en historien pour contrôler l'image que la postérité retiendra de lui. En cela, il fait écho au travail du dramaturge qui nous livre à travers lui une réflexion sur les stratégies d'écriture de l'histoire. Dès le début de la première partie d'Henri IV, lors du monologue où il expose son intention de mettre en scène sa réforme future, on comprend que le prince Hal cherche à donner au présent la forme qui lui permettra d'orienter l'avenir comme il le souhaite, pour établir les bases selon lesquelles le passé devra être lu et compris dans le futur. Les spectateurs sont témoins du fossé entre la vérité et la fiction modelée par Hal pour le public. C'est pour cette raison que sa réforme est si soigneusement mise en scène à travers le bannissement officiel de Falstaff et de ses compagnons de débauche lors de son couronnement. C'est ce spectacle qui va permettre d'effacer le souvenir de sa jeunesse tumultueuse et d'influencer l'opinion. Une fois devenu roi, Hal conserve la même attitude. Lors du discours qu'il fait à ses soldats à la veille d'Azincourt, il approuve les récits rétrospectifs améliorés des événements. Je cite, « All men forget. Yet, all shall be forgot, but he étant the soldier, but he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall our names, familiar in his mouth as household words, Harry the King, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester, be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son. And Crispian shall never go by from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. » Ça reste quand même un passage particulièrement beau. C'est pas pour rien qu'il est si célèbre maintenant. Ce discours est tourné à la fois vers le passé et vers l'avenir. Henri évoque les héros du passé que sa propre mémoire fait revivre et se projette dans l'avenir quand on se souviendra de son nom et de celui de ses soldats with advantages, avec les embellissements qu'il peut faire en contrôlant le récit qui sera fait des événements à venir. De la même manière, dans le discours de l'évêque Ely au roi au début de la pièce, Henri V ne fait qu'un avec ses valeureux ancêtres. Ils revivent à travers lui. Awake remembrance of these valiant dead. And with your puissant arm, renew their feats, dit Ellie au roi, acte 1, scène 2. Cette déclaration va bien plus loin qu'une simple comparaison entre passé et présent. Il y a identification absolue. Les héros du passé vivent à nouveau à travers leur héritier. Lors de ses 2 grands discours à ses soldats, Henri V cherche à provoquer leur loyauté en faisant allusion d'une part aux morts du passé, d'autre part à leur propre mort à venir. Les vivants doivent faire honneur aux morts et chercher à renouveler leurs exploits. Henri utilise la mémoire pour nourrir le sentiment national chez ses troupes. Le discours d'Azincourt ne porte pas sur la bataille, il porte sur le souvenir, la commémoration de la bataille dans le futur. Ce discours proleptique fusionne le contexte de la pièce et celui de sa représentation. La victoire de l'armée anglaise est connue d'avance, acquise dans le discours de Saint-Crispien, tout comme elle l'est au moment de la représentation de la pièce. Les références d'Henri aux futures commémorations d'Azincourt vont de pair avec la vision de la bataille comme étant elle-même une nouvelle édition des victoires passées. Pour Jonathan Bardo, dans Wars of Memory in Henry V, les allusions aux futures commémorations de la bataille d'Azincourt lui donnent le caractère bien établi d'un événement ayant déjà eu lieu, préservé, voire même sacralisé par la mémoire. En présentant un événement à venir comme un fait accompli, l'avenir incontrôlable prend l'allure rassurante de la mémoire. Passé, présent et avenir ne font plus qu'un. Ils sont ramenés sur le même plan par Henri, qui promet la postérité aux vivants comme aux morts. Leur sacrifice leur assure d'être rassemblés dans la mémoire collective de la nation sous une image glorifiée, inspiratrice pour les années à venir. Contrôler les mémoires apparaît donc comme un enjeu, non seulement pour le roi, mais pour la nation tout entière. Le discours de nostalgie patriotique prononcé par Henri V trouve un écho à la coloration très différente dans les paroles de son soldat Williams, qui lui aussi imagine la manière dont on va se remémorer les événements, mais avec effroi. Je cite, « But if the cause be not good, the king himself has a heavy reckoning to make, when all those legs and arms and heads chopped off in a battle shall join together at the latter day and cry all, we died at such a place, some swearing, some crying for a surgeon, some upon their wives left poor behind them, some upon the debts they owe, some upon their children rawly left. » Le discours de Williams représente un défi à l'autorité du roi et une critique de la nostalgie patriotique sur laquelle repose le sens de la nation. Dans Henri V, Shakespeare explore la relation entre la mémoire et l'histoire. Comme le fait remarquer Bardo, l'exercice du pouvoir dans la pièce est lié de manière inextricable au processus d'oubli. En évacuant de sa mémoire les éléments gênants pour la construction de son propre mythe, Henri rend son esprit d'autant plus disponible pour ses visées dynastiques et nationales. De ce point de vue, comme l'argumente le critique, la pièce constitue une remarquable étude de la manière dont une nation se souvient, mais peut-être encore davantage dont elle oublie. Le pouvoir est donc noté, selon Bardo, d'une nature profondément amnésique. Il oublie tout ce qui pourrait le remettre en question, tout ce qui représente une menace pour l'unité nationale, et ce, de manière d'autant plus efficace qu'il le fait sous couvert du souvenir et de la commémoration. Même si la rhétorique du souvenir est omniprésente dans la pièce, il y est avant tout fait usage de l'oubli. Afin d'imposer sa propre version de l'histoire, Henri doit rejeter les versions non officielles, voire subversives, ce qui est symbolisé par l'éviction de Falstaff et de ses acolytes. Contrairement à ce qu'annonce le chœur à la fin de la seconde partie de Henri IV, Falstaff ne réapparaîtra pas dans les pièces historiques. Le bannissement de Falstaff peut être lu comme la réaffirmation du contrôle du roi sur les multiples histoires non officielles de ses sujets. À la fin de Henri V, le souvenir de Falstaff se dissout. Même Llewellyn, à la mémoire pourtant encyclopédique, a oublié son nom. Henri V doit contrôler sa propre mémoire autant que celle des autres. Il ne peut pas se permettre de se remémorer ses anciens compagnons. Il prétend donc avoir oublié le nom de Falstaff, contrairement aux héros du passé dont il énumère les noms et honore la mémoire. Comme le souligne Bordeaux, l'oubli systématique de Falstaff et de ses compagnons par Henri V a dû sembler particulièrement contradictoire à un public ayant vu son personnage sur scène encore quelques mois auparavant et encore plein de son souvenir. On apprend que Falstaff est mort, le cœur brisé par le rejet de son compagnon d'aventure. La mise à distance du passé dans le but de construire l'image qui passera à la postérité suppose la destruction intégrale de ce qui précède. Le coût de l'histoire est élevé et la célébration de Henri V que l'on trouve dans le chœur se trouve ainsi fortement nuancée. Pourtant, le passé ne se laisse pas oblitérer facilement. Ceux que l'on a voulu oublier reviennent hanter les vivants. Falstaff en particulier parvient à troubler la version expurgée de la mémoire nationale qu'offre Henri. Le spectre de Falstaff hante tout le début de la pièce à travers les discussions de ses compagnons de taverne. Le pathos avec lequel sa mort est relatée ne peut qu'amener le public à nuancer le mythe d'Henri V comme héros national tel qu'il est présenté par le chœur et tel qu'il est passé à la postérité. Le fossé entre le joyeux monde populaire qui a été banni et le nouveau monde héroïque semble énorme. La réflexion sur la nature du récit historique et la transmission de l'histoire se double d'une modification de certains événements de la part du dramaturge. Ces modifications, parfois minimes, ont des effets divers sur le public, en particulier sur les spectateurs contemporains de Shakespeare qui n'auraient pas manqué de remarquer les changements. Shakespeare sélectionne soigneusement les détails qu'il agence afin d'obtenir une intrigue cohérente et efficace et de donner aux événements et la coloration qu'il souhaite. Il mêle les événements et les personnages historiques à des personnages et des anecdotes fictifs, notamment les personnages populaires, l'intrigue secondaire, et il les transmet dans le présent du théâtre. C'est probablement dans Henri V, dans toutes les tétralogies, c'est probablement dans Henri V que Shakespeare a effectué le plus de modifications. Toutes sont porteuses de sens et sont potentiellement subversives. Par exemple, il choisit de faire passer l'armée d'Henri non pas par Southampton, comme les sources nous l'apprennent, mais par Douvres et Calais. Calais avait été prise par Édouard III en 1347 à l'issue de la bataille de Crécy, puis regagnée par les Français en 1558, marquant ainsi la perte pour l'Angleterre de la dernière de ses possessions sur le continent. 1558 marque aussi le début du règne d'Élisabeth, qui n'aura de cesse de chercher à regagner la ville pendant tout son règne. Pour Baudin, les références à Calais dans Henri V, dont l'action montre l'empire britannique continental en construction, ne peuvent que rappeler au public la douleur de la perte du dernier fragment de cet empire. Comme il le souligne, les effets des références à Calais sont diamétralement opposés pour Henri dans le monde de la pièce et pour Élisabeth à l'extérieur. Pour le premier, le souvenir de Calais est galvanisant. Pour la seconde, la ville symbolise les immenses peurs et frustrations liées aux relations tendues avec la France et l'Espagne. L'importance de Calais est bien plus qu'une simple importance stratégique. Elle possède une lourde charge symbolique. Les changements opérés par Shakespeare forment donc bien souvent des commentaires obliques et ambigus sur la situation politique contemporaine. On est loin de la célébration inconditionnelle de l'État Tudor. Ainsi, la question de l'Irlande, au cœur des préoccupations des Élisabétains, est au centre de la pièce, grâce en particulier aux références au pays de Galles. Les pays celtiques apparaissent dans Henri V à travers les personnages des 4 capitaines, l'Écossais Jamie, l'Irlandais MacMorris, le Gallois Llewellyn et l'Angleterre étant, elle, représentée par le peu recommandable Pistol, ancien compagnon de Hal et de Falstaff. En plus de leur potentiel comique et de l'intermède qu'ils fournissent, les personnages de MacMorris et de Jamie ont pour principal effet de garder l'Irlande et l'Écosse, toutes deux au cœur des affaires politiques et militaires de l'Angleterre élisabéthaine, à l'esprit des spectateurs. Ils sont associés au Gallois Llewellyn, qui représente, contrairement aux 2 autres, un peuple celte assimilé avec succès. Les 4 capitaines peuvent être vus comme une référence anachronique au mythe d'une Grande-Bretagne à l'origine unifiée et sur le point de l'être à nouveau. On observe en effet dans l'Angleterre élisabéthaine la conviction grandissante que la nation n'est pas l'Angleterre seule, mais l'Angleterre assortie du Pays de Galles, de l'Irlande et de l'Écosse. D'une certaine manière, la situation de l'Irlande dans les années 1590 peut être vue comme une répétition de celle du Pays de Galles au début des années 1400, avec la rébellion de Glendower mise au premier plan des 2 parties de Henri IV. L'Angleterre s'évertue à assimiler l'Irlande comme elle a intégré le Pays de Galles auparavant. En 1415, la pacification du Pays de Galles est bien plus avancée que ne l'est celle de l'Irlande en 1599, année qui marque le cœur d'une campagne désastreuse en Irlande menée par le comte d'Essex, favori de la reine. Les origines galloises des Tudors ont beaucoup facilité la pacification du pays de Galles. Les Gallois ont gagné une certaine autonomie dans leur annexion et avec l'acte d'union de 1536, Henri VIII impose les lois, les méthodes administratives et l'Église de l'Angleterre, mais permet aussi la création de 24 nouveaux sièges alloués au pays de Galles à la Chambre des communes. Une telle assimilation n'a jamais été proposée aux Irlandais. En outre, alors que l'Angleterre avait réussi à se faire des alliés des grandes familles galloises, elle a persécuté les familles dirigeantes irlandaises. Si bien que, comme l'avance Bordeaux, en plein conflit irlandais, Henri V offre l'image du succès de l'assimilation des Gallois comme modèle de celle à effectuer pour les Irlandais. Cependant, les nombreuses images de violence et de massacres de la pièce viennent assombrir ces espérances. Le parallélisme entre le pays de Galles et l'Irlande est renforcé par l'allusion au retour d'Irlande du comte d'Essex à la fin de la pièce. Le chœur compare le futur retour de France d'Henri victorieux à l'entrée triomphale de César à Rome et à celle non encore advenue et qui n'aura pas lieu d'Essex revenant d'Irlande, liant passé, présent et futur de manière inextricable. Ce sera ma dernière citation. The mayor and all his brethren in best sort, like to the senators of the antique Rome, with the plebeians swarming at their heels, go forth and fetch their conquering Caesar in, as by a lower but as loving likelihood, were now the general of our gracious empress, as in good time he may, from Ireland coming, bringing rebellion broached on his sword, how many would the peaceful city quit to welcome him? Much more, and much more cause, did they this harry. Cette référence à Essex n'est pas dénuée d'ambiguïté. En l'espace de quelques vers, le chœur rabaisse Essex en le comparant à ses prédécesseurs, by a lower, but as loving likelihood, jette le doute de manière prémonitoire sur son retour victorieux d'Irlande et l'associe avec une menace pour la paix de Londres. De manière ironique, Essex va échouer, tombera en disgrâce, fomentera un complot et finira par être exécuté. Et j'en viens sans aucune transition à ma conclusion. Bien qu'Henri V soit traditionnellement étiqueté comme la pièce de Shakespeare la plus patriotique, la présentation du roi et de la monarchie est loin d'être dénuée d'ambiguïté. Le décalage entre ce que dit le chœur et ce qui nous est donné à voir est en grande partie responsable de cette complexité. Lorsque le roi tant attendu apparaît enfin dans la pièce éponyme, sa perception est teintée d'ambiguïté. Les critiques sont très divisées quant à savoir s'il faut voir la pièce comme une célébration héroïque ou une subversion ironique du héros en son centre. S'il est évident que Shakespeare ne nous livre pas une célébration pure, sa description n'est pas entièrement subversive pour autant. On voit Henri dans une double perspective. Dans la pièce, il est dans la fleur de l'âge. Il ravive le souvenir des héros du passé et poursuit leurs exploits. Mais du point de vue du chœur, qui partage l'espace-temps du public, Henri lui-même est un héros mort, dont la pièce ravive le souvenir. Ce contraste ouvre la possibilité de la remise en question, de la vision de la mémoire nationale comme étant le fruit de la manipulation pratiquée par les rois, les conquérants et les colonisateurs envers les dissidents et les vaincus. De ce point de vue, l'épilogue de la pièce constitue une chute brutale. Le rappel de la mort d'Henri à un âge précoce et de la perte de la couronne et des territoires par son fils met à distance l'héroïsme dont nous venons d'être témoins et le fait paraître sinon vain, du moins tout relatif. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup Frédéric Foissier pour cet exposé qui a présenté d'une façon pour moi tout à fait passionnante la façon dont le récit historique peut être présenté sur la scène d'un théâtre. Puis aussi j'ai été vraiment très, très intéressé par les mises en abîme auxquelles vous vous êtes à plusieurs reprises livrés. Alors là encore j'imagine qu'il y a des questions. Si l'on respecte strictement l'horaire tel qu'il était prévu, le temps de débat est assez réduit puisque cette première partie de la journée d'études devrait se terminer à 15h20. Mais peut-être que nous pourrons déborder un petit peu. Je me tourne vers Nathalie qui me fait signe que oui, alors un petit peu, peut-être pas trop.
Oui, on peut prendre de plus pour qu'on soit à l'aise quand même.
Ouais, je crois que ça le mérite, sans abuser, un petit peu plus.
Ouais.
Donc j'ouvre le tour de questions. Qui veut, parmi ceux qui sont connectés d'abord, qui veut poser une question ou intervenir?
Alors d'abord, c'est moins une question que, étant donné que je suis en train de lire le chat en même temps que donc ça se déroule, féliciter les deux intervenantes de la part de ceux qui nous regardent en ce moment, des 240 personnes qui nous regardent en ce moment. Hein, si vous n'aviez pas le track, maintenant vous l'avez, hein, vous avez 240 personnes devant vous. Et qui vous remercie toutes les deux de vos interventions. Vraiment, il y a plein voilà. Donc, ceci étant dit, moi j'avais juste une micro-question, si je peux la lancer maintenant. À Valérie, peut-être, vous parlez de la signature donc, du traité de Troyes et je me demandais un peu les conditions de signature en fait, du traité, quelles étaient les langues des fois utilisées et le territoire en fait choisi. Comment on choisissait choisissait tel ou tel endroit pour se rencontrer et pour élaborer ce traité, un peu en lien avec cette notion du multilinguisme qu'on trouve dans la pièce de Shakespeare et ces batailles de territoire. Est-ce que les traités avaient des prérequis linguistiques pour ceux qui les négociaient?
Les traités, en fait, sont souvent rédigés en latin, qui, pour le coup, est la langue diplomatique du temps. C'est d'ailleurs l'exemplaire anglais tel qu'il nous est conservé aujourd'hui, mais on a aussi un exemplaire en français. Quant au lieu de signature, je l'ai évoqué rapidement, on est dans un territoire qui est sous emprise bourguignonne et on sait bien que c'est la main du duc qui a tenu la plume, en l'occurrence, de ce traité, sous les auspices, bien sûr, d'Henri V. Hein. Alors, pour savoir si on a des lieux de rencontre particuliers sur le plan diplomatique, oui, au Moyen-Âge, on se rencontre souvent sur des ponts ou sur des espaces frontaliers, qu'on dit aussi en marche. Hein. Voilà, histoire de respecter la neutralité de chacun, enfin, la neutralité de chacun dans un espace dit neutre.
Merci. Louise?
Et Louise pose une question.
Pour Valérie. Alors, je ne suis pas du tout historienne, donc c'est peut-être une question très naïve, je ne sais pas. En fait, je me demandais dans quelle mesure on pouvait voir dans l'impossibilité d'appliquer cette double monarchie à la France et l'Angleterre, dans quelle mesure on pouvait y voir aussi peut-être des réactions nationalistes. Est-ce que c'est complètement anachronique ou est-ce que c'est quelque chose qui pourrait entrer dans cette interprétation ?
Non, alors on a le sentiment que l'opposition politique, elle est plus marquée du côté anglais, d'abord parce qu'on est dans une situation qui est pour le moment plus stable en Angleterre. On voit bien que c'est du côté des parlementaires qu'on a des réserves. Du côté français, c'est une même réaction qu'on pourrait qualifier de patriotique aussi, mais elle s'exprime de facto, c'est-à-dire que ce sont des gens qui prennent les armes pour lutter contre l'occupation anglaise. Voilà, donc c'est pas tant au texte qu'on s'en prend, mais on s'attaque concrètement aux garnisons ou aux formes d'occupation des Anglais. Mais ce qui est vrai, c'est que le tournant de la guerre au début du XVe siècle est marqué par cette émergence très nette des deux côtés de la Manche d'un sentiment qu'on pourrait qualifier de patriotique, hein, effectivement, puisqu'on a des pamphlets qui sont échangés de part et d'autre qui injurient tantôt les Anglais, évidemment, du côté français, on injurie aussi les Anglais. Donc, on a deux peuples qui s'affrontent. On a aussi dans les sources françaises des expressions qui sont très signifiantes. Il y a ceux qui se sont ralliés du côté des Anglais, ce sont les Bourguignons pour l'essentiel et leurs partisans, qu'on appelle les Français reniés, qui s'opposent aux bons Français. Donc il y a bien une partition politique qui est liée à l'attachement à un royaume, à une nation en germe, de toute évidence.
D'autres questions peut-être? D'autres interventions?
Moi, si je pouvais juste ajouter une remarque ou une question à ma collègue sur le traitement par la pièce donc, de Shakespeare des Écossais, des Irlandais qui est en fait une vision très intéressante au moment, si j'ai bien compris, où se structure l'image de la nation britannique. Il faut savoir que pendant la guerre et lorsqu'on travaille sur les traités de reddition, ou même quand on étudie certains conflits et certaines batailles, le traitement réservé par les Anglais aux Écossais et aux Irlandais est redoutable, hein. Ils sont systématiquement massacrés.
Oui, c'est ce que j'ai pu lire, par contraste apparemment avec ce qui s'est passé avec le Pays de Galles,
Oui.
bien avant, même si ça n'a pas été sans perte et sans atrocité, mais apparemment le traitement n'a rien à voir. Le traitement des Irlandais et des Gallois, par exemple, est radicalement différent.
Y compris juridiquement, hein, parce que je parle de massacres dans les après-batailles, mais lors des traités de reddition, il est spécifiquement écrit qu'ils sont exclus de toute négociation.
Merci, ça m'intéresse.
Merci aussi.
Moi j'ai aussi une question pour Frédéric, qui est également naïve. Donc, j'ai été frappé par ce que vous avez montré dans la pièce, d'éléments qui pourraient paraître subversifs face à un récit officiel. Mais ma question, c'est est-ce qu'il existe à l'époque où écrit Shakespeare quelque chose qui s'apparenterait à un récit officiel du règne d'Henri V?
Il n'y a pas de récit officiel, il y a plusieurs récits qui coexistent, qui cohabitent. Il y a toutes les chroniques qui ont été plus ou moins commanditées par les Tudors quand ils sont arrivés au pouvoir, puisqu'ils voulaient absolument asseoir leur légitimité et prouver que voilà, ils étaient légitimes sur le trône d'Angleterre. Donc, on a des versions vraiment très fortement en faveur d'Henri V qui vont dans ce sens. C'est les chroniques de Hall, par exemple. C'est ce qu'on peut trouver voilà, dans des textes similaires. Chez Holinshed, qui est la source principale de Shakespeare, c'est un peu plus ambigu parce que c'est déjà un texte polyphonique qui a été écrit par plusieurs historiens. Donc, selon l'historien qui écrit, la vision peut être un peu différente et quelque part, on trouve un reflet de ça dans le théâtre finalement, avec ces différentes voix qui se font entendre. Et puis, surtout, l'année avant Henri V, il y a eu une pièce anonyme qui s'appelait The Famous Victories of Henry V et qui était, elle, clairement une glorification de Henri V. Et on pense vraiment, basée sur justement les chroniques de Hall plutôt que celles de Holinshed. Et on pense vraiment que Shakespeare a vu cette pièce et s'en est servi, a pris certains éléments, les éléments les plus patriotiques, pour ensuite en faire autre chose. Après, il faut savoir que Henri V a deux versions, une version quarto, une version folio, donc ça, c'est des problèmes textuels assez compliqués. Les deux versions sont différentes et nous livrent une vision du monarque différente aussi. La version quarto étant plus à la gloire de Henri V et la version folio, qui est celle dont j'ai parlé et qu'on a dans les éditions aujourd'hui, étant beaucoup plus ambiguë, puisque justement, on nous rajoute le cœur, on nous rajoute une intrigue secondaire qui viennent ajouter de l'ambiguïté et d'autres voix.
Merci beaucoup. Oui, Nathalie.
J'avais perdu mon micro. Alors là, je me refais le relais de la voix des questions dans le chat. Elles arrivent. Donc, une première question. Donc, en fait, à peu près pour les deux intervenantes, hein, y avait-il des Écossais parmi les soldats de Henri ou bien étaient-ils systématiquement des ennemis alliés aux Français?
Alors, si je peux me permettre de ce que je sais, les Écossais qu'on a trouvés à Azincourt, c'était plutôt des mercenaires engagés chez les Français, d'après ce que j'ai pu trouver. Donc, voilà, des Écossais dans les troupes de Henri. Je pense que Valérie est bien meilleure que moi pour répondre, mais ça m'étonnerait.
Non, non, bien sûr, c'est ce que j'évoquais tout à l'heure. Les Écossais sont très nombreux et ont amené des hommes de guerre de manière importante sur le continent jusqu'à la défaite de Verneuil, qui a été une saignée redoutable pour les Écossais. Il ne faut pas oublier qu'en France, on a eu un connétable qui était écossais, un John Stuart. ce qui n'est pas rien en termes de reconnaissance militaire. Donc, ça, c'est les effets de ce qu'on appelle the Old Alliance, vous le savez aussi bien que moi. Hein. Donc, les Français ont aidé pendant un certain temps les Écossais sur leur propre territoire pour lutter contre les Anglais. C'est la stratégie habituelle de l'ouverture des doubles fronts. Et puis les Écossais, pardon, un lapsus non révélateur. Les Écossais ont énormément aidé effectivement les Français sur les champs de bataille. Verneuil a été une telle boucherie que voilà, ça a séché ce flot. Et donc, cette collaboration franco-écossaise est si mal perçue par les Anglais, ça revient à revenir sur, enfin, ça m'amène à revenir sur ce que j'ai dit tout à l'heure. Cette collaboration franco-écossaise explique que les traités de reddition et les combats, lorsque les Anglais sont victorieux, sont redoutables pour les Écossais qui sont systématiquement massacrés, comme les Irlandais, qui, eux, c'est vrai, sont un peu moins nombreux dans les troupes françaises.
Donc, on pourrait dire que Jamie, le personnage de Jamie ici est véritablement, voilà, ne correspond pas du tout à la période d'origine. On est sur un déplacement en plus. C'est un prétexte, c'est un personnage prétexte pour parler en fait, d'un autre conflit qui est bien problématique et qui ennuie bien la couronne à ce moment-là. Sans le dire évidemment, mais parce que une autre question effectivement concerne le fait que l'utilisation des mercenaires, si je ne m'abuse, la plupart des soldats n'étaient pas des conscrits, mais bel et bien c'était pas des armées de métier, mais ils étaient engagés, payés à l'époque. Oui ou non?
Alors, tout dépend de quel côté on se place là encore de la Manche. Du côté anglais, on a ce qu'on appelle des contrats d'endenture qui sont des vrais contrats, et c'est une vraie modernité dans l'histoire de la guerre et de la façon de recruter des hommes de guerre. Donc, les contrats prévoient une durée d'engagement avec le paiement de capitaines qui eux-mêmes se chargent en retour de rétribuer donc, des hommes qui vont combattre ou en Angleterre ou sur le continent. Pour autant, c'est le mot mercenaire qui est un peu anachronique parce que bon, ils sont payés comme tels. Il y a en France un système qui ressemble plus au mercenariat, au sens où on va recruter par exemple des arbalétriers en Italie qui sont payés et qui, dès qu'ils sont en danger d'ailleurs, prennent la fuite. Mais les Écossais qui viennent servir en France ont un autre statut. Ce serait un peu abusif de les qualifier de mercenaires, même s'ils sont rétribués par la couronne. Il y a une alliance diplomatique entre ces deux territoires, entre ces deux royaumes, qui explique donc cette collaboration militaire. La France paye aussi, au bout d'un certain temps d'engagement, ses vassaux. Enfin, le roi peut dédommager ses vassaux au-delà d'une certaine période d'engagement militaire. C'est un peu plus compliqué. Voilà. Donc, il y a des mercenaires, mais il y a aussi des contrats. Et même s'il y a un contrat féodal, enfin un engagement féodal, cela n'exclut pas non plus la rétribution des hommes d'armes.
J'ai une dernière question dans le chat, alors qui est un pont en fait, plutôt avec la période très contemporaine là, pour le coup. Alors je lis. Ce que Madame Toureille a décrit vis-à-vis du rattachement de la France à l'Angleterre peut-il se rapprocher de ce qu'on connaît par le terme d'évolution aujourd'hui au Royaume-Uni? Je sens qu'on a des... should I translate it for Stuart and Patrick, or you okay? Should I translate that question? No, you're fine. What do you want to... Do you want to give an answer to that? Sorry to put you on the spot a bit.
Je dirais qu'on est dans le mouvement inverse. Hein.
Ouais,
Plutôt que de se rapprocher, les Anglais ont pris le large.
Patrick?
Je peux comprendre en français.
Oui.
Mon français n'est pas parfait, mais je peux comprendre en français, ça va.
Non, est-ce qu'on peut vraiment rapprocher ça du processus de dévolution?
Ah, d'évolution.
Ah, de dévolution.
De dévolution, oui. Non, clairement, on est dans le côté Brexit, on est vraiment dans l'effet inverse, ouais, là, clairement. Peut-être... peut-être pas vraiment, c'est un peu tôt pour parler de ça et pour faire le parallèle. Ouh là là, il y a de plus en plus de commentaires qui arrivent. Donc, y a-t-il une question? Non, non, ce sont des commentaires qui remercient et qui clarifient 2-3 questions. Donc non, je pense qu'on peut laisser la dévolution de côté pour l'instant, vu ce qu'on disait en fait du rôle de l'Écosse, surtout dans la pièce de Shakespeare où il y a cette question du prétexte, mais en même temps, on va peut-être revenir justement dans le deuxième atelier sur la question écossaise et en parlant donc de territoires légaux. Notamment dans l'intervention de Stuart Elden qui va très certainement donc revenir sur cette question écossaise, à la fois le prétexte mais aussi l'ancrage de la question écossaise qui n'est pas finalement si anodin que ça dans la pièce de Shakespeare. Je vous remercie, Daniel, de votre présidence et je remercie chaleureusement vraiment les 2 intervenantes qui ont ouvert le bal de ce moment YouTube. Nous allons enchaîner. Merci encore. Donc,
Merci à vous.
pour le deuxième atelier.
Merci.
So I'm going to switch now to English. Stuart, are you ready to be with us? And it's a great pleasure to introduce Stuart Elden, who's with us today. He's a professor of political theory and geography at the University of Warwick. Is the author of a wonderful book called Shakespearean Territories. That's how I discovered his writings, and actually I devoured the birth of territory actually as a result. Thank you. It was very enlightening actually talking and seeing your take as a geographer and as a specialist of political theory of this notion of territory. And so you're currently preparing a book on the early Foucault, and I suppose it's with the pandemics and all the work, it must be quite something to go back on the Foucault ship, and it's due to be published in 2021, I think. So, and we're really looking forward to that. So today you're going to talk about legal territories in Henry V. So the screen is yours, and I'll leave you to share your screen.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So the reading I'm going to give today is of Henry V, and it draws on the 5th chapter of the book that Natalie just kindly mentioned, Shakespearean Territories. And given the audience today and the other speakers, I'm not going to try and give any background to the play. We've heard about the historical context of the play as outlined by Valerie, its status as a history play as discussed by Frédéric. And I'm not going to say very much about the 2 variant texts that we have of the play, which briefly came up in the discussion. But what I want to try and talk about is the geographies of the play. Now, there are some fairly obvious geographies of the play, and I'll say a little bit about those, but I want to focus particularly on the legal geographies. So the geographies begin in very beginning in the prologue, when the chorus asks if this cockpit, the stage within the theatre, can enclose the vasty fields of France, so the territories, the battlefields over which and on which the fighting will take place. Now, while the spatiality of the stage is certainly one aspect of that speech, the geographies that are being imagined, that we're being asked to imagine by the chorus, are also significant. And the word fields appears many times through the play, over 20 times in the folio text. And that's both the fields of France in an agricultural sense, but it's also the battlefields which England and France will fight over to decide the fate of those lands. They're imagined as the terrain through which the soldiers will march to reach the battle, the bloody field where the valor may be won, the strategic position of forces, the battle itself, we hear the glorious and well-foughten field, and the burial ground for those that will die in the war. So the fields are the site and the stake of the contestation, the object and terrain of their struggle. Now, while I'm interested in the legal questions in the play, I'm going to largely gloss over one of the key legal debates about the play, whether it's a pro-war or a cynical take on the war. And as Frederic said, this is partly enabled by reading the two different texts, the quarto and the folio. But instead, my focus is going to be on these legal geographies. And I want to focus particularly on the play's opening scene after the chorus, which is a scene that only appears in the folio edition of the text. And in it, the Bishop of Ely and the Archbishop of Canterbury discuss the political situation at the time and the position of the church. The Bishop and Archbishop want to discuss the threat to their temporal lands. So these are lands that the church owns as landlords, not by nature of their spiritual possession, but because of the church's earthly wealth. And the struggle between church and king over such lands reoccurs through European history of this period. Shakespeare, of course, had explored it before. It's a significant theme in King John, for example, with the bastards sent to raid the monasteries at the same time that the king is in dispute with Pope Innocent and his legate, Cardinal Pandulph, about jurisdiction over the English kingdom. And later in Henry V, the king assents to the hanging of Bardolph, a friend from his youth, for the crime of stealing from a church, although that's obviously of a much smaller scale. And more generally, the ownership of land, the question and the debates about this, and the relation between a monarch and a landlord is a central theme of Richard II. But in Henry V, it seems the legal questions are dominating these economic ones. So at the outset of Henry V, the discussion is occasioned by a bill that is passing through Parliament that will tax the church's temporal lands, with the idea being that the revenue raised from them can go directly to the crown, and it's in part to support its wars and arm and feed the necessary armies. It's a bill, we hear, that is the same one as one proposed in the 11th year of the last king's reign, that is in 1413 at the time of Henry IV, but had failed due to the scambling and unquiet time in which it was first put forth, scambling meaning contentious or disordered. So how will the church be able to resist it now? Well, Canterbury notes that it must be thought on. If it pass against us, we lose the better half of our possession. For all the temporal lands which men devout by testament have given to the church, would they strip from us, being valued thus, as much as would maintain to the king's honour full 15 earls and 1500 knights, 6,200 good esquires, and to the relief of lazars and weak age, of indigent faint souls past corporal toil, 100 almshouses right well supplied, and to the coffers of the king beside, £1,000 by the year. Thus runs the bill. What Ely replies that this would drink deep, to which Canterbury retorts, 'twould drink the cup and all. So these lands, which are more than half of what the church possesses, are lands that have been given to the church in the testaments of devout men. That's actually a slight legal slip because testament pertains to personal rather than real or landed property. But the value of the land has been reckoned, and as well as the specific support envisaged, would leave enough land, or leave enough capital rather, to produce interest yearly. Shakespeare gives the likely figure gained by interest, and his historical source in Holinshed's Chronicles said £20,000 as capital. So thus runs the bill, plays both on the legal sense of the bill, the act that is passing through Parliament, and the sum, the total yield from this dispossession. And the church objects to the support for the aristocracy and the army, but also to sick and diseased persons, and to those too old to be able to work and support themselves. Lazars are specifically lepers, though the term has perhaps a broader sense of the ill. Weak age, that's the elderly. Indigent means poor or otherwise needy. So economic questions then, but here explicitly situated within this legal framework. Now, the key legal struggle of the bulk of the play, though, is not between the church and the state, but it's between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France. And in this opening scene, we discover that Canterbury is trying to divert the king from taking lands from the church by suggesting the conquest of France. Canterbury remarks that the king is full of grace and fair regard, and Ely endorses this, suggesting he is a true lover of the Holy Church. They go into a short digression about how his previous behaviour did not suggest this was likely, which for the audience, of course, harks back to his actions in the two parts of Henry IV. But he's now, apparently, a reformed and religious character. Eli pulls the question back to the key matter at hand. How now for mitigation of this bill urged by the Commons? Doth His Majesty incline to it or no? Well, Canterbury replies that he has a plan. He seems indifferent, or rather swaying more upon our part than cherishing the exhibitors against us. For I have made an offer to His Majesty upon our spiritual convocation, and in regard of causes now in hand, which I have opened to His Grace at large, as touching France, to give a greater sum than ever at one time the clergy yet did do his predecessors part withal. Indifferent here has the sense of impartial rather than unconcerned. Swaying implies facilitating but inclining in a particular way, while the exhibitors are those that have sponsored the legislation. Canterbury suggests the king may be persuaded by this case, but there was not enough time to go into all of the details. He hints that more needs to be explained concerning the severals and unhidden passages of his true titles to some certain dukedoms, and generally to the crown and seat of France, deriving from Edward, his great-grandfather. Severals here has the sense of specifics or particulars. Unhidden passages suggest that the lineages are clear. Some claims to dukedoms have already been made, while the larger claim to France as a whole is still to be decided. Now, while legal questions are behind this, it ends up being just such a war as needs the kind of financial support that the bill had been designed to provide. Now, this question of France is pressing because the French ambassador has already come to the court as we're hearing these speeches, and it appears that it was his arrival that broke off the earlier exposition by the Archbishop. But the king delays the ambassador's audience until he has heard more from the legal, that is, the religious advisors. We would be resolved before we hear him of some things of weight that task our thoughts concerning us and France. Now, the dying Henry IV had suggested just as much to his son. Be it thy course to busy giddy minds with foreign quarrels, that action hence borne out may waste the memory of the former days. And this is advice that the new king quickly follows. As his brother suspects, I will lay odds that ere this year expire, we bear our civil swords and native fire as far as France. I heard a bird so sing. Now, the key legal question concerns the Salic law, la loi Salique. So the king asks Canterbury to explain it. My learned lord, we pray you to proceed and justly religiously unfold why the law Salique that they have in France or should not bar us in our claim. Now, the king clearly knows the potential, but he affects some caution. And is he simply looking for an excuse to go to war, or is he genuinely wanting to be on solid legal ground? Well, he asks the Archbishop to explain the situation, but he cautions he should not fashion, wrest, or bow your reading, or employ sophistry, or invent false claims, or otherwise violate the truth. He underlines this by noting the risk and the likelihood of many deaths, and he asks him to weigh his words carefully. For God doth know how many now in health shall drop their blood in approbation of what your reverence shall incite us. Therefore take heed how you impawn our person, how you awake our sleeping sword of war. We charge you in the name of God, take heed. And to this, Canterbury replies, then hear me, gracious sovereign, and you peers that owe yourselves your lives and services to this imperial throne. There is no bar to make against your highness's claim to France, but this which they produce from Pharamond. In terram salicum mulieres ne succeedant. No woman shall succeed in Salic land. For which Salic land the French unglostly glows, to be this realm of France, and Pharamond the founder of this law and female bar. Yet their own authors faithfully affirm that the land Salique is in Germany, between the floods of Saale and of Elbe. Thus he claims it's only the Salic law that might prevent a legal or legitimate claim by Henry. He's looking to interpret or to gloss this, to comment on the text and to expand on its meaning and significance. Pharamond was an ancestor of the Frankish kings. The logic and prescription of the law is not in doubt, but the location that it applies to is open to question. France declares it applies to its own territory, and therefore the inheritance through the English King Edward III cannot be allowed, because that's matrilineal. Thus it prevents Henry of England from laying claim to it. Edward III was the great-grandson of Philip III of France. He was great-grandfather to Henry V. It's a descent through the female line, with Edward II's wife Isabella being granddaughter to Philip. She was the daughter of Philip IV, son of Philip III. All of Philip IV's sons succeeded him as king, but none produced male heirs. If the descent could not pass down the female line, then the existing French king, Charles VI, who descended from Philip III's other son, Charles, Count of Valois, would be legitimate in holding the crown and the lands. The French defence then requires the Salic law to apply to France. The Archbishop claims the law applies to lands further to the east, to modern-day Germany, between the Saale and the Elbe, known as the area of Messian, and therefore Henry can claim a legitimate right to the crown of France, which is a kingdom located in a place where the Salic law does not apply. It is not then simply an interpretation of the law that is at stake, or a tracing of the genealogy, but the spatial determination of this jurisdictional question. Canterbury then expounds at length on this genealogy and the complicated interweaved ancestries of European nobility. It's a very long speech, and it's been described as a speech that is unrivaled for tedium anywhere in Shakespeare's works, as interminable, or one that nobody could possibly hear without indifference. And like the discussion of the bill to take the church's temporal lands, this material in the play is often taken word for word from Holinshed's Chronicles, that provides nearly all of the basis and the background material, and at times Shakespeare really versifies it. He turns it into a verse, but takes the language almost directly. Now, the geographical clincher to the argument for Canterbury is that Charles the Great, that is Charlemagne, did not seat the French beyond the river Saale until 805, which is some time after Pharamond's rule and the Salic proclamation. And in the theatre, humour is often generated from his long speech that's full of legal niceties and complicated lineages, which he may claim is as clear as the summer's sun, which is usually said at such a speed that it makes it incomprehensible. And at the conclusion, the king cuts through, wanting a single clear yes or no answer. May I, with right and conscience, make this claim? Now, if you've seen some of the film versions of this or stage adaptations, these scenes are often cut, or if they are included, some of these parts are often played for comedy value. In the Laurence Olivier film, there's the sort of the throwing of the different scripts of paper around as they're trying to expound on this legal basis. And on the page, it appears a very dry, fairly boring speech, but it is fundamental to the plot, and I want to take it seriously. Because apart from anything else, the Archbishop's speech is filled with phrases concerning deposition and usurpation by King Pepin and Hugh Capet, which hint that as being the son of the usurper Henry IV, Henry's claim to the English throne is suspect, let alone a claim to the French. So it therefore provides an important link back to Shakespeare's earlier plays, as well as providing a basis for the rest of this play. Did Shakespeare intend to satirize this convoluted argument, or was he at this point so obsessed with historical accuracy and therefore a bit tone deaf to how it actually might play to an audience? If it's played for comedy and to create bewilderment, the audience might be forgiven for theory. What really is the point and what is at stake? But this speech is one that does need to be taken seriously by the theatre audience as much as it is taken seriously by the stage audience. And the king's trying to cut through all of this is really trying to make sure that this is a case that he can make with some kind of legal basis. So these fundamental legal geographies, as I've suggested, that are in these opening scenes really are important in the play, but they're important in at least two ways. One is this relation between the church and the state. Another is the lines of inheritance that structure succession and claim, but it is the purpose of the church to try to deflect Henry's interest from the lands of the church by trying to divert his attention to this question of France. And the Archbishop provides Henry with the encouragement that he wishes for this, suggesting that the Book of Numbers provides a scriptural basis for inheritance to pass to the daughter, and saying, "Gracious Lord, stand for your own, unwind your bloody flag. Look back into your mighty ancestors. Go, my dread Lord, to your great-grandsire's tomb, for whom you claim, invoke his warlike spirit, and your great-uncles, Edward the Black Prince, who on the French ground played a tragedy, making defeat on the full power of France." It's an effective piece of rhetoric. It links the legal and patriotic claims to the lineage, both of birthright and of martial courage. The French ground meaning both the French lands or territory, and also the terrain of the battle itself. But there's complexities that are glossed over here. Edward III and the Black Prince are held up as male exemplars, which quickly dispenses the female inheritance that gives Henry his actual claim. In addition, Henry holds the crown because his father, Henry IV, had seized it from Richard II, son of Edward the Black Prince, who's now held up as an ideal. Now, Canterbury is not the only one advocating war against France. The Bishop of Ely lends his support too, suggesting a thrice puissant basis. You are their heir, you sit upon their throne, the blood and courage that renowned them runs in your veins. Descent, possession, and valour give him a threefold basis of strength as a support for his claim. Encouragement also comes from the Dukes of Exeter and Westmoreland. Blood then is a common noun in their speeches too, invoking the ties of inheritance, the martial spirit, the consequences of war. And as Exeter says, your brother kings and monarchs of the earth do all expect that you should rouse yourself as did the former lions of your blood. So we hear that the hearts of the nobles and the subjects of England have already reached France. The king has petitioned to let their bodies join them, pavilioned in the fields of France. And Canterbury almost gives away the real purpose when he suggests that this action, this military action against France, will be supported by the aid of the spirituality, that is the church, and that it will raise more for the king than the clergy ever did for his ancestors. Now, the contemporary resonances of this discussion of the Salic law and the question of succession are significant. At the time that the play is written, the situation with Queen Elizabeth and the possibility of her marriage and the children of any marriage is a very topical legal question. And in these opening scenes, we can see how the Archbishop works through the details of the genealogical basis of descent. The conquest of France through military power then becomes the main dramatic thrust of the play, from Harfleur to Agincourt. And then in the final act, the covenant is established through the marriage of Catherine and the passing of the French line to Henry and his heirs. And as well as the war with the French, the opening scenes also discuss the relation England has to Scotland, with the reserve of some of the English forces to guard against a Scottish attack while the main army is abroad. And Henry's army, and we heard this in Frédéric's presentation and the discussion, Henry's army is famously made up of all of the British nations, Jamie from Scotland, Llewellyn from Wales, Macmorris from Ireland, and Gower from England. But in addition, many of these soldiers are small landowners, yeomen, who are asked to show the mettle of your pasture. Well, that opens up the importance of a third group to the play, not just the church and not just the nobility who lead the fight, but the producers, those that make up the bulk of the army, the conscript soldiers, the ones that end up actually doing the fighting. And this, of course, is related to Georges Duby's book on the three orders on feudal society. It's a book that is indebted to Jacques Le Goff, the medievalist, but also to Georges de Mezille, the comparative mythologist, on who the distinction between sovereignty, military power, and production is crucial, the trifunctional analysis that he finds in so many mythologies and religions. And Duby, in this book on the three orders, takes up this idea and grounds it in a reading of particularly French history. And what I discovered just in preparing for this, that Georges de Mezille attended Georges Duby's final seminar at the Collège de France, where they discussed some of these ideas and showed how his more mythological and religious work could be put into practice in a study of French history. The other question of just war, not simply the right to go to war, but also the legitimate conduct in war, jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Well, that's most explicit, the just conduct in war. That's most explicit in the siege of Harfleur, when Henry threatens the mistreatment of civilians, including destruction, murder, and rape, but also the execution of the prisoners at Agincourt. So that legal reading could potentially continue through those parts of the play, but also into the courtship scenes with Catherine and the relation of the possession of her body with the conquest of France's territory. The scene where she's learning English, and it's English for parts of the body, so it already has strong sexual overtones. That's a scene that comes immediately after the siege of Harfleur. And the scene where she is in direct conversation with Henry is after the Battle of Agincourt. And I know that Jean-Christophe is going to speak a bit about these themes. So the legal tone of the beginning of the play therefore returns at the end, because the peace to be sealed between France and England depends on a number of articles, first of which is the possession of Catherine as Henry's queen. She is our capital demand, comprised within the forerank of our articles. So I'll just conclude by saying that the legal aspect of territory is not the only aspect of territory that I think is important. It's not the only aspect of it in Shakespeare's plays. There's economic, strategic, technical, corporeal, colonial, geophysical, many aspects in which we might think about territory that perhaps goes beyond the narrowly conceived political and geographical we tend to associate with the term. And Shakespeare, I think, sheds light on many of those different aspects. So what I try and do in Shakespearean Territories is both to use territory as a lens through which we might read Shakespeare, but also to suggest that Shakespeare is an interesting theorist of territory, or at least that we can develop a political theory of territory from reading many of Shakespeare's plays. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Actually, it's a brilliant conclusion and about how really our different fields are interacting around Shakespeare and how and what we can actually draw from Shakespeare. Just not only the literature, but not only the stylistic figures, because our poor students we played them a lot of the time with that, but also actually how we can actually derive some theoretical imaginings from Shakespeare, and how we can treat Shakespeare really as a laboratory. It's this permanent laboratory where we can actually test historical methodology, but also literary methodology, and think more and more about that. And I think that Jean-Christophe will have a lot of things to say about that as the others. And so thank you again. Change to a grid view so we can see all of us. And before I start speaking too much, and I have also questions in the chat. So, but first, if our colleagues want to interject already and ask a question to Stuart and Jean-Christophe, or they should, and I'm going to start.
I'm all ears.
And actually, it's a question to for the two of you. And I was thinking about that scenes, the Act 4, Scene 4 scene with Lefair, the boy, and Pistol. And you raised the issue of being of the absence of territorial belonging to a certain extent, this sort of homelessness of the French Huguenot being lost in the audience of a London crowd, of a London theatre, mirroring actually the English soldiers being lost in the French territory with an unfriendly language. And actually, this scene, this particular scene in Act 4, Scene 4 is quite multilingual, and we have actually the process of translation with this third-party negotiator that the boy is playing and translating. So, do you think that this scene's multilingualism provide a different view of territory? I mean, either geographically or politically? In a way, can he provide something like that?
I think it does. Yes, certainly. I think it unsettles. I mean, I think that Shakespeare somewhere has a view. Well, wants to unsettle. It's not just a question of verisimilitude, because he could have done it well beforehand. He actually chose this scene as a crucial scene to actually address those questions of nationhood, and also to actually switch territories, so to speak, within the means that he had at his disposal, that is theatre. And I'm always interested in when I watch live theatre, at the reaction of English spectators, how they react to that. Well, some of them obviously have some knowledge of French, but others really struggle and are in unknown territory, and very much rely on the kinetic play on words in the first scene, and are really a bit at a loss.
Relearning actually is just Shakespeare is giving us a new language lesson, considering in a lot of the language manuals it's the language of the hands was so important.
Yeah, I think he's turning the tables really on Henry's conquest. He's showing how through, you know, linguistic means and theatrical means, how territory is a complex notion, and that can be switched around, and how alienation can affect both the French and certainly the English, to the extent that they are a bit at a loss actually as to where they actually are at that moment in the play. What's going on, you know, if you haven't seen the play before.
So you would say the territory is a bit of a limbo then? Rather.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and because I was just thinking of what Peter Burke was saying about the role of language in constructing and reconstructing communities. And I was wondering if this linguistic interplay could have actually the same effect on the notion of territory. Is it possible, especially with that scene, or the really multilingual scene, to offer a different vision of territory, or if it's more a projection? What I mean, a less antagonistic vision of territory. I don't know.
I think it's probably less antagonistic. It's also, I mean, we shouldn't, I spoke of microhistories. This is not part of the macro history, but it does have resonances beyond the microhistory. As I pointed out, it's, well, certainly from the point of view of the early quartos, this scene was unbounded. The characters could choose to link it up with Hoffler or not. So there was, the territory became kind of blurred. They could link it up with the dialogue as well that ensues. There is about, well, sexual innuendo also, and bawdy talk about Catherine, which goes beyond the scene itself. But I don't think that it has an overall bearing on the notion of territory in the macro history of Shakespeare's Henry V. I don't think it has that strength, actually. Yeah, it's a moment.
Stuart, you wanted to add something to that?
No, I think that's a very helpful way to think about it in terms of the micro and the macro. This isn't a scene that I've thought about in relation to territory. I suppose one thing would be that this is one of those scenes that we can look at about the legal question of conduct in war, compared to the question of whether you can legitimately go to war. So so it's a scene about jus in bello, the rights or the law in war, rather than a scene about jus ad bellum, which is what I was focusing on, which is the legitimate right to go to war in the first place. I don't think I have very much to say about this particular scene, but one thing I suppose I'd say is that for me in the reading that I'm trying to do, I'm trying to use territory in quite a specific sense.
Yes.
And the extension of the register of the term territory to apply to other things, I think, is perfectly legitimate and interesting, but it's not quite what I'm doing in
yeah, I totally get that.
But the other thing I will say, which I possibly should have said in the presentation part, is Shakespeare uses the word territory very, very rarely. It's in King Lear, and it's in As You Like It. And then territories, plural, is in about 6 or 7 plays, I think. So it's an unusual word in Shakespeare's English. But the times that he does use it, I think, have quite a lot of significance. But I think that the problematic of territory and a sort of a nascent concept of territory is present in many more of Shakespeare's plays. But Henry V is not one of the plays in which the word territory or territories actually appears. So for me, there's also a linguistic question in the relation that a word has to a concept, which is something in the book I explore in quite a lot of detail.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart.
And any other questions from the floor, or should I actually ask there are two questions in the chat, but if one of the speakers wants to say something, or no, I can go with the chat. First chat question is actually from our colleague Michel Vigneault in Lyon, and we're saying hello. And
hi.
And she was actually she said that she was perplexed by Henry's line in Act 1, Scene 2, line 269. And we never value this poor seat of England. And she would like to have both your thoughts about that, that specific line, that's a vision, I think. We never value this poor seat of England. And maybe what is this valued and the attachment to the geography of England?
Shall I try and say something?
Yes.
So the value is an interesting one. I mean, it's an economic one, so it's a question of worth relation to something else. So there's a kind of comparison in this. Seat is both a kind of a situation or a location of England, but it's also the authority or the status. Like the seat of a bishop or something like that is their particular status or the position that they're in. So Henry's in part kind of trying to characterize how he thinks that the Dauphin has seen him, and in that he neglected things that you know, what comes with our wilder days, not valuing or not measuring the use we made of them. And in a sense, it's a continuation of what the Dauphin is saying about that, or how Henry thinks the Dauphin has seen him, that he didn't value England. I suppose the comparator, though, is whether Henry is trying to make a point about, for him, England isn't as important as France. And so that the status of France is the thing that he's concerned with. And in comparison, England is a smaller, or is of less value perhaps to him. But I think it's important that I think he's still characterizing what he thinks the Dauphin thinks of him, even though he's talking about the way that in his younger days, he maybe didn't give enough credence or enough importance to his position. But now in the present, England is less of concern to him than France. That would be my quick attempt to try and...
Yeah, it is. I think it's. I'm getting a thank you actually from the virtual participants, and so because I'm having them through chat and emails at the same time. It's a lot that going on. And actually, Patrick, do you want to ask? You wanted to ask something. I kind of interrupted in the middle of your movement. You were kinetically going to ask something.
Yes, I mean, I suppose I'm interested in both of these papers in relation to the first tetralogy. So I think, you know, so for example, for Jean-Christophe, mistranslation between French and English becomes a problem in Henry V in a way that it wasn't in the earlier plays with Henry VI or Margaret of Anjou, or even Joan of Arc. You can imagine similar play there, but it doesn't happen in quite the same way. And likewise, I'm curious about this question of a perceived English claim to French territory. We get one vision of that in Henry V. I'm curious, is that a change from what we see in the first tetralogy, is sort of the relation of the one to the other, especially in light of that, the epilogue to Henry V that says, and then all of this was lost. You know? So any thoughts you might have on the relation to those earlier plays would be of interest.
Well, if I may jump in, I think the earlier plays are mostly concerned about, you know, English civil wars, and so they're not so much concerned. Well, although they take place in France, they are about the loss of French territories, and so whereas in Henry V, the perspective is completely changed. It's about not losing, but actually conquering. And conquering obviously implies a level of control, and we can see how control is linked to language and imposing not only force, but imposing a language and the force of that language. So I would say that perhaps in the early history plays, the focus is quite different, because it's about the loss of France, whereas there it's an invasion of France in Henry V, and that turns the tables quite a lot linguistically.
If I can just add to that, I think that's helpful because it is about the loss of those territories. There's the line in part 2 when Somerset tells the king that all your interest in those territories is utterly bereft you, all is lost. And the interest in territory, the stake or the standing in territory, that's the way that Lear talks about it in the opening scene, where he divests himself of all interest of territory, cares of state. So Henry VI is interesting about the loss of those, the progressive loss of those territories. I suppose the other early play that's interesting, well, I think mostly the history plays are interesting around territory, but King John is also interesting in terms of the state of territory in France for the English crown, at the same time as there is the question about who should actually be holding the English crown and whether it's Arthur who's backed by France. But there's a territory question in King John as well that I think is interesting.
Great.
Sorry. And I have 2 questions from the floor. One very quick one. What do you think is the role of neologism in the play? And maybe Jean-Christophe, you want to take this one, or any others. Why inventing words? Well, why Shakespeare invents words? That's his trademark. That's his business. And but besides that, what do you all think? And could be this sort of the linguistic strategy behind inventing words like that? That could be an interesting thing to debate, actually.
Well, just a quick answer. I think it's part of Shakespeare's wordplay, really, and which is one of his features. And he's a master at wordplay to the extent that I think if one wanted to pinpoint one of the reasons why so many readers, early modern readers and annotators and scribes actually lift passages from Shakespeare is because he is such a master of wordplay. And in this particular instance, I think the wordplay really serves to create linguistic confusion, obviously, and which is part of probably his intent because confusion is here to show that the play is certainly not univocal, that it is both a nationalist piece, but that it is also a piece that escapes nationalism, and that the wordplay is ideal for this kind of slippery movement away from nationalism, and a kind of bathos, a pathetic effect on nationalism. But that's my take.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to add something to this sort of the very common word coining? It depends where the words or are being borrowed from. Sometimes it's word coining, and it's true whether it's going to be Italian, Latin, Greek, French. It's and it can be sometimes probably linked also to the moment where there is an import, and also sometimes very pragmatic reason that there's no equivalent really word at hand, so you have to kind of create one, which is the beauty of modern English, is to be in a sort of very aggregative, no pun intended for the people sitting the aggregation, a very aggregative language, and it's and that's the beauty of it. And Shakespeare knows how really to kind of mold them and play with that. Indeed, but it kind of meshes with the interest also and the situation in Henry V. I had just a last question maybe about whether or not we can draw a parallel between Henry V and Julius Caesar, because there were places where, and the discussion also of power and this sort of fallen heroism somehow. Can we really draw a parallel between those places, or they're really broaching different different visions of the head of state? It's kind of an open question to the entire floor. So it's not mine originally, so it's just, don't look at me like that. I see you looking. It's that kind of question just before the break.
They are close, aren't they? From a production point of view, and it's tempting to actually think that the Julius Caesar may contain some effect, some material from Henry V. But having said that, I think the politics in Julius Caesar are really extremely different from Henry V. That would be my short answer.
Yeah, it's a sort of the anatomy of power is very inward looking. It's, you are within the territory, we have the political territory, the political entity, whereas with Henry V, you constantly hovering between, as you said, Stuart, between very local domestic issues, the church, or the problem with Scotland and the borders, and actually the actual true problem with the ongoing problems with France and the dispute that is going to last a little bit longer. So it's just we have two kind of crossing perspectives.
I think perhaps the one of the common points would be Julius Caesar's tendency to create proleptic speeches in the way that you know, we have the speech, the Agincourt speech, which Frédéric talked about, which is really meant to create a myth. Whereas there are speeches which in Julius Caesar, which are also very proleptic, and that are built to construct a legend around a number of characters, and in particular Julius Caesar. So from that point of view, I think there's certainly a link. Yes.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Stuart and Jean-Christophe, for your
pleasure.
Really great. So we're going to just take a short recess and we'll be back for more talks. Let's say we will be back at 4:50. Is it okay with everyone? 4:50? Just a little bit of time to refresh. Donc, je vais prévenir, donc vous pouvez couper vos caméras. You can cut your mic and cameras for now. Donc, je vais juste expliquer un peu donc nos spectateurs, pardon. Donc nous allons faire une courte pause. Je vais l'écrire dans le chat et nous reviendrons. Donc voilà, le flux va pas du tout s'interrompre. Et on va reprendre simplement la parole à 16h50, donc dans 7 minutes. Voilà, donc merci de votre patience, merci d'être là un vendredi après-midi et à tout de suite. Passionnante, il fait gris dehors, on a une pandémie, mais qu'est-ce qu'on est stimulé. Merci encore à tous les participants de leur énergie et de toutes ces superbes présentations. Donc, je vais céder la parole à ma collègue Jeanne Mathieu qui va présenter donc notre jeune collègue Louise Fang. C'est un grand plaisir d'accueillir de nouveau Louise à Toulouse. La dernière fois, c'était en 3D. Cette fois-ci, bon, d'accord, c'est par écran, mais on va y arriver. On se retrouvera à un moment donné en vrai et si possible autour d'un bon verre, je pense. Ça nous fera plaisir à tous. Donc, je laisse la parole à Jeanne. Je vous dis. Jeanne, Jeanne, le son.
Merci. So our next speaker is Miss Fang. She's a lecturer in Elizabethan and Jacobean drama at the Université Sorbonne Paris Nord, ex-Paris 13. She completed her PhD on theatre and games in William Shakespeare's plays at Sorbonne Université in October 2019, under the supervision of Professor Dean Cottony. Her presentation is entitled Playing Dice at Agincourt, Games of Hazard and Providence in Shakespeare's Henry V. The floor is yours.
Right. Well, thank you very much for hearing me today. I'll just share the screen. Oh, there we go. Okay, so great, thank you. Right, so today I'll be talking about playing dice at Agincourt, Games of Hazard and Providence in Shakespeare's Henry V. Shakespeare's Henry V teems with references to early modern games and sports. As underlined by Guillaume Winter in his paper entitled The Varnish of a Complete Man, Shakespeare et l'Homo Ludens, the types of games that are alluded to in the play are wide-ranging, from the cockpit mentioned by the chorus in the prologue to the insulting tennis balls the Dauphin offers the King Henry V in Act 1, Scene 2, or the proverb capping match between the French nobles in Act 3, Scene 8. The references to so many games in a history play might seem surprising at first, as it is not entirely in line with the epic tone the chorus adopts in order to celebrate the heroic victory of Agincourt. Indeed, most of the time, the use of games to describe wars or diplomatic tensions in early modern Europe resulted from satirical intent. Gaming scenes serve to underline the vanity and cupidity of monarchs or the papacy, as we can see from this early satirical print entitled Le Revers du Jeu des Suisses, and printed in France around 1514 or 1515. The Dauphin's gift to the English king in Act 1, Scene 2, and the extended tennis metaphor that ensues, undoubtedly takes up, as is the case of many other games and sports in Shakespeare's history plays, according to Gregory Clance-Semenza. Moreover, the games we find in Henry V are decidedly unchivalrous. More importantly, there is almost no mention of archery in the play, as Anne Curry underlines. Archers are remarkably thin on the ground, and anyone reading the play without knowledge of other accounts of the battle could be forgiven for thinking that archers and their arrows play any decisive part in the English victory. This absence is all the more striking as archery was actively promoted as the national sport by Tudor monarchs, as Evelyn Tribble has shown in her paper entitled Where Are the Archers in Shakespeare? In fact, several texts in favor of archery explicitly reminded readers of the crucial role of the longbows at Agincourt, as we can see from this extract from Roger Ascham's Toxophilus. King Henry V, a prince peerless and most victorious conqueror of all that ever died yet in this part of the world, at the Battle of Agincourt, with 7,000 fighting men, and yet many of them sick, being such archers, as the Chronicle saith, that most part of them drew a yard, slew all the chivalry of France to the number of 40,000 and more, and lost not past 27 Englishmen. By contrast, in the multiple games mentioned throughout the play, one type of game in particular stands out, and yet has attracted less critical attention, and these games are games of hazard, including wagers and dice. Although these may seem at first to fulfill an essentially contextualizing purpose, I would like to argue in this paper that they are also, paradoxically, instrumental to the construction of a providential narrative of Agincourt, which is put to the fore through the ludic rhetoric in Henry's lines in the play. So firstly, I will expose the terms of the debates on games of chance in early modern England. This will then lead me to analyze how these issues are echoed in the portrayal of the Battle of Agincourt. And finally, I will underline how the ambiguities surrounding games of chance are used by the king himself in his construction of the narrative of Agincourt. So I would like to show how games are one of the strategies behind the history telling used by the king, as one of the strategies of history telling mentioned by Frederick earlier. So first of all, games of hazard, and especially dice, were among the most widespread ludic practices in medieval and early modern Europe, probably because these were the cheapest games available, and dice, for instance, could be made out of a great variety of materials, as revealed by recent archaeological findings. In 1597, dice were so widespread that, according to Gilbert Walker, I quote, "Only of dices Her Majesty might have an army sufficient to bid the King of Spain a battle." Soldiers, in particular, were known to be avid dice players. According to French historian and game specialist Jean-Michel Mel, soldiers represented more than a third of the players of games of chance in the late Middle Ages. Geoffrey of Monmouth also mentioned soldiers playing dice between fights in his History of the Kings of Britain. Early modern depictions of game scenes also conveyed this image by representing soldiers at the gaming table, as we can see from this engraving by Crispin de Passe, which warns against the choleric temperament caused by playing games, and in this specific case, backgammon. That Nym and Pistol should quarrel about a gambling debt in Act 2, Scene 1 of Henry V might therefore recall the popularity of games of chance among common soldiers of the time. I'll just read from this passage in Act 2, Scene 1. "You'll pay me the 8 shillings I won of you at betting. Base is the slave that pays." However, games of hazard in general were also among the most controversial games of Shakespeare's time. Dice, in particular, epitomized all the ills of gambling and were even given pride of place in the titles of treatises and pamphlets against games, as we can see from these two examples. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see the title page of Gilbert Walker's A Manifest Detection of the Most Vile and Detestable Use of Dice Play and Other Practices Like the Same, from 1555. And on the right-hand side is John Northbrook's treatise from 1577, entitled A Treatise Against Dicing, Dancing, Plays, and Interludes with Other Idle Pastimes. Authors often brought to the fore the fights and violence that these games triggered, as well as the cupidity of the players, and they sometimes even appealed to local authorities to have these games banned altogether, as did James Bomford in 1600. The chief argument, which led some authors like those I just mentioned to consider these games as dishonest, according to the terms of the time, was, however, essentially religious in nature. In addition to the pagan origins associated with most games of chance, Puritans often emphasized that the workings of these games were reprehensible because they led the players to appeal to God's providence for an unworthy purpose. In an anti-ludic treatise entitled A Glass for Gamesters and printed in 1581, the preacher Thomas Wilcox explains this argument at length. "I take these games of dice and cards, being, as I said before, games of lot, hazard, or chance, to be flatly against the third commandment, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. The reason that leadeth me thereunto is this: lot, or chance as we call it, is one of the principal testimonies of the power of God, because it is ruled and governed immediately by his hand and providence, and was never ordained of God for anything but for matters of great weight, and never used amongst the godly, but in causes of great importance, as in parting of goods, dividing of lands, etc. Besides that, it seemeth to be a manner of tempting of God, when we know that he will not have this used, but in matters of great weight and importance, and yet we will use it in things of no value, as though we would make God a servant of our pleasures, laughters, and delights." This argument may be found in most treatises against games of chance. The Calvinist theologian Dudley Fenner, for instance, also concludes the section dedicated to games of chance in his treatise on the misuse of God's providence. I quote, "From all this I gather that dice, dealing of cards or such like, where the matter is laid on hazard, as they call it, or rather God his providence, without using any cunning of ours to dispose it, is upon the same reason of a lot unlawful." The chance players so avidly sought in such games was therefore conflated with manifestations of God's will. This view was only significantly challenged in 1627 by Thomas Gattaker, who asserted in his treatise on the nature and uses of lotteries that, I quote, "being a chance event does not make it part of God's providence." But even then, Thomas Gattaker was quite isolated in the debate on games of chance. As we shall now see, the terms of the debate on games of chance in early modern England, and more specifically this confusion between chance and providence, sheds some light on the ludic references in Henry V. The negative associations of games of chance pervade Act 3, Scene 8, where the French nobles are shown indulging in a series of games on the eve of battle. Of course, the French propensity to play games implicitly levels the same criticism that was implied by the Dauphin when he offered the tennis balls to Henry V in Act 1, Scene 2. But there is a particular emphasis on their taste for dice games and wagers. In Act 3, Scene 8, we can see Rambior's asking, "Who will go to hazard with me for 20 prisoners?" Constable answers, "You must first go yourself to hazard ere you have them." Going to hazard here is an expression for betting, which was probably derived from one of the most popular games of the time, hazard, which was played with 2 dice. In addition to Rambior's reference to hazard in this scene, the chorus takes up the image of the French who the low-rated English play at dice in Act 4, with a special emphasis on the word dice, which is placed at the very end of the line. The image of the French betting on their future victory is then again taken up by the English king himself as he tries to revive the courage of his soldiers the night before the battle. So the king here is disguised, of course, and he says, "Indeed, the French may lay 20 crowns to 1 they will beat us, for they bear them on their shoulders, but it is no English treason to cut French crowns, and tomorrow the king himself will be a clipper." These allusions to dice playing therefore serve to highlight the hubristic optimism of Rambior's and contribute to the stereotype of the boastful French before battle, as is made evident by the much more circumspect attitude of the Constable of France. In fact, later in Act 4, their unexpected military discomfiture is encapsulated by Bourbon's rhetorical question, in which the image of dice is used once more in order to underline the reversal of situation that took place on the battlefield. "Be these the wretches that we played at dice for?" The emphasis on the French soldiers' dice playing, of course, contributes to the disparaging image of Henry's enemies in the play. It may also bring to mind the biblical subtext associated with this specific game. By the end of the 16th century, Roman soldiers playing dice at the foot of the cross had become a favored subject of painters, as you can see from these 2 examples. And here you have the Roman soldiers playing dice at the bottom of these paintings. And this was a relatively new development, as earlier representations of the crucifixion rather tended to feature soldiers drawing straws. And this is something you can see in this earlier painting by Andrea di Bartolo, where the soldiers are drawing straws. And in fact, the biblical sources only mention soldiers casting lots, without specifying whether this is done with dice or other means. The objectification of the low-rated English at the French soldiers' dice play therefore also invites us to read this scene as a rewriting of this specific moment in the Bible, equating the overly confident French with the reckless Romans. And of course, this subtext indirectly contributes to glorifying the English and Henry V as a Christ-like figure as well. Perhaps more unexpectedly then, considering the reputation of games of hazard and dice, throughout the play, the battle is conceived of and described in ludic terms by the English characters as well. but this time in a way that plays on the conflation between providence and chance, which I've mentioned earlier. This is perceptible through the numerous references to odds and what Jonathan Baldo has termed the obsessive concern of Henry V for numbers. Before the battle itself, for instance, Henry's soldiers insist on the disproportionate odds the English are facing. Of fighting men they have full 70,000, there's 5 to 1, besides they all are fresh. God's arms strike with us, 'tis a fearful odds. Presenting the Battle of Agincourt in terms of games of chance has two major implications. Firstly, these ludic references might make up for the material shortcomings of the stage repeatedly mentioned by the chorus. Representing the battle in terms of wagers and dice games is a way to draw from the most appealing dimension of games of chance to represent Agincourt, perhaps in order to galvanize the audience who was probably very familiar with these popular games. As the physician Pescasius had analyzed at the time, and as it has been confirmed by much more recent studies, what truly animates players of games of chance is not so much the financial gain to be drawn from a lucky throw, but the feeling of hope and anticipation before the game or the wager itself. It might be said then that although the play does not portray the spectacular dimension of the battle on stage, it metaphorically recreates this feeling of anticipation linked to an unlikely victory at a game of chance. Secondly, and as Salisbury's exclamation from Act 4, Scene 3 makes clear, the insistence on the unfavorable odds suggests that only a divine intervention may reverse the situation. The mention of odds and wagers in Acts 3 and 4 therefore contributes to strengthening the impression of an unexpected and miraculous reversal of situation that occurred on the battlefield thanks to a divine intervention. As a matter of fact, Henry V is not the only play by Shakespeare using a metaphor taken from games of chance to suggest a providential reading of a historic battle. In Richard III, the eponymous character on the field of Bosworth declares, "I have set my life upon a cast, and I will stand the hazard of the die." In Henry V, what is particularly interesting is that Shakespeare shows us how the providentialist reading of the outcome of a wager or a game of chance is also used as a rhetorical tool in Henry's lines throughout the play. The English king consistently brings to the fore the considerable risks he takes by undertaking his military campaign. In doing so, Henry eventually turns the English victory of Agincourt into an irrefutable divine sanctification of a conquest whose legitimacy was initially far from being indisputable. The gambling metaphor is consistently found in Henry's lines to describe warfare itself. In Act 3, Scene 7, as he justifies the harshness of his punishment of Bardolph's theft, he portrays the English conquest of France as a wager between lenity and cruelty. For when lenity and cruelty play for a kingdom, the gentler gamester is the soonest winner. The term gamester was generally derogatory and therefore significantly jars with the ideal of chivalrous warfare. The moral condemnation gambling was usually subjected to therefore seems to be suspended in Henry's lines in favor of a ludic approach to warfare. In fact, the very moment in which the king decides to wage war against France in Act 1, Scene 2, takes up all the terms of a perilous wager. His reiterated use of the exclusive or in these lines especially underlines that he is going for broke. Now are we well resolved, and by God's help and yours, the noble sinews of our power, France being ours, will bend it to our awe, or break it all to pieces. Or there will sit, ruling in large and ample empery, o'er France and all her almost kingly dukedoms, or lay these bones in an unworthy urn, tombless, with no remembrance over them. Either our history shall with full mouth speak freely of our acts, or else our grave, like Turkish mute, shall have a tongueless mouth, not worshipped with a waxen epitaph. In this perspective, we might liken Henry to the figure of Julius Caesar, who we talked about earlier, and who inspired another play at roughly the same time. In his decision to declare war, the deictic now emphasizes the momentous aspect of the decision Henry has just taken, and is therefore reminiscent of the renowned Alia Jacta Est. Indeed, like Caesar crossing the Rubicon, Henry V is ready to lose everything as he crosses the Channel to conquer France. This all or nothing approach is again emphasized in the heroic couplet, which concludes Act 2, Scene 2, after the arrest of Cambridge, Grey, and Scrope. Cheerly to see the signs of war advance, no King of England, if not King of France. In that perspective, Henry's famous words before the Battle of Agincourt in Act 4, Scene 3, "We few, we happy few," is particularly interesting. According to the logic we find in these lines, the fewer men, the greater share of honor. In saying so, Henry overturns the strategic rationality at work in battles and wars in favor of a markedly symbolical one. Moreover, the word happy here might also hint at its etymological sense of lucky. Indeed, the fewer they are, the luckier they are in case of victory, and if there is a victory, the more divinely assisted the English will seem. Henry presents his military strategy as if it was that of a player staking his all. What he's hoping for is a highly significant and symbolical victory. By showing that his strategy ultimately relies on tempting fate, he ultimately legitimizes his political power, despite the doubts he himself voices in his monologue at the end of Act 4, Scene 1. Indeed, in the aftermath of the battle, Henry once more explicitly underlines the role of providence in the English victory, as he had done before the battle, and declares, "Praised be God and not our strength for it." As he himself suggests that such a victory could only be achieved through divine assistance, Henry validates the causes that have led him to wage war against the French in the first place, hereby also putting an end to the criticism of the risks he took, voiced by some of his own soldiers in Act 4, Scene 1. To conclude, the precarious situation of the English, underlined by the themes of gambling, fortune, and hazard throughout the play, therefore indirectly serve the glorification and heroization of Henry V. This can be seen through the wages of the French, of course, but also, and perhaps more unexpectedly, in Henry V's own description of war as a hazardous wager. One of Henry V's many ambiguities is therefore to show how its eponymous character uses the rhetoric and logic at work in the most controversial games of Shakespeare's time in order to shore up his political legitimacy and pave the way for a providential reading of history. The initial accusation of the Dauphin towards a king who was deemed too inclined to frivolous games in his youth is therefore ultimately turned to Henry's advantage as he wins his wager at Agincourt. In fact, the attractiveness of this gambling narrative still holds sway today. Just a few weeks ago, as I was preparing this, I came across a book by Matthew Bennett from the Illustrated Military History Series campaign on the Battle of Agincourt. And even though this book exposed the strategies, the rational strategic reasons for the English victories, its subtitle was Triumph Against the Odds. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. So thank you so much for this fascinating presentation on how games are used to write and rewrite history in Henry V. So I think that I'm going to introduce our next and last speaker today, Patrick Gray, who is Associate Professor of English Studies and Director of Liberal Arts at Durham University. He's the author of Shakespeare and the Fall of the Roman Republic, published in 2019, editor of Shakespeare and the Ethics of War, and co-editor of Shakespeare and Montaigne, and Shakespeare and Renaissance Ethics. His essays have appeared in Shakespeare's Survey, Comparative Drama, Journal of Medieval and Early Modern Studies, Shakespeare Jahrbuch, and Cahiers Shakespearean Devenir, as well as collections such as Shakespeare and the Soliloquy in Early Modern English Drama and Shakespeare au risque de la philosophie. His paper is entitled Megalothamia and the Last Man, Henry V, Hamlet, and the Problem of Honor. The floor is yours.
Bonjour et merci. J'ai été tenté d'essayer de faire cette présentation en français, mais je crains de finir à mettre votre patience à l'épreuve. So I'll continue in English. Thanks for bearing with us. Okay, so it's the question is Henry V an ideal king? I suppose is the question in the back of our minds when we think about this play. Or is he, as the English critic William Hazlitt says, an amiable monster? One way to make sense of this king's notorious ethical ambiguity is to see Henry V as attempting to navigate between the incongruent claims of two rival ethical systems. On the one hand, Christianity, and on the other, a political order driven by imperatives of honor. If it be a sin to covet honor, he confesses, I am the most offending soul alive. The fascinating word in that admission is if. Can the nobleman's traditional pride and force of arms be reconciled to Christ's admonition to turn the other cheek? Perhaps not. If a soldier takes no satisfaction, however, from success on the battlefield, how effective, if at all, is he likely to be if he should find himself willy-nilly face-to-face with a determined enemy? Falstaff is good for a laugh, but a worse than incompetent commander. His indifference to achieving any kind of victory with the soldiers who serve under his command proves just as deadly to them in the end as Hotspur's recklessness would have been. Too little desire for honor is just as dangerous as too much. Like most of us today, Shakespeare is deeply suspicious of the notion that the pursuit of martial honor in and of itself could ever be considered adequate grounds for taking any kind of military action. In Homer's Iliad, for example, men like Achilles raid and plunder without pretext or compunction. To conquer is glorious without any further complication. For Shakespeare, however, as for Virgil, any honor that accrues to those victorious in battle must be weighed against the suffering which made that triumph possible. There must have been some sort of injury, or at least some sort of threat, what in just war theory would be called a casus belli. Whether or not an effort to regain lost territory qualifies as such a case is debatable. As Professor Elden noted earlier, the scene in Henry V in particular, in which the Archbishop of Canterbury tries to convince Henry V that his claim to France is legitimate, is often played for laughs. But I often wonder if we today are too quick to dismiss his argument. And it strikes me that Queen Elizabeth's legitimacy depended in part on the same kind of discrediting of misgivings about women inheriting the throne that the French Salic law represents. I also thought, 400 years from now, what will people think of our intricate debates about Brexit, for example? You know, it may be that at the time, people had more of an appetite for this kind of tangled consideration of genealogy. In any case, from the perspective of an early modern Christian, it's possible to imagine other and more obviously worthy justifications for war, including what we might now consider wars of foreign conquest. In King John, Salisbury grieves to find himself taking up arms with the French against an English king, even for a cause that he sees as just, the restoration of papal authority. O nation, he cries, that thou couldst remove unto a pagan shore, where these two Christian armies might combine the blood of malice in a vein of league, and not spend it so unneighborly. Even Erasmus, who is known, and who indeed is for the most part as an outspoken pacifist, makes an exception for armed European resistance to the ongoing expansion in Eastern Europe of the Ottoman Empire. Henry IV longs to go on crusade, and Shakespeare presents this venture, much against the grain of present-day multiculturalism, as an idealized alternative to more grievous wars between fellow Christian nations. Shall not thou and I, Henry proposes to Catherine, shall not thou and I compound a boy half French, half English, that shall go to Constantinople and take the Turk by the beard. For many of Shakespeare's countrymen, and perhaps even for Shakespeare himself, the restoration of greater Christendom in the Holy Land was a paradigmatic example of a legitimate justification for military action. Honor itself, however, was suspect as a cue for war. Shakespeare's clearest attack on the intrinsic value of honor as this kind of pretext appears in Troilus and Cressida, his version of the story of the fall of Troy. Hector argues there with considerable force that the Trojans should not support Paris's adultery, then abruptly resolves nonetheless to keep Helen still for the sake of their joint and several dignities. And Troilus agrees, I would not wish a drop of Trojan blood spent more in her defense, but, he says, she is a theme of honor and renown. So this volte-face in their reasoning is sometimes seen as a problem, but I think it is meant to be dubious. We're supposed to doubt it. It's the same kind of self-deceptive casuistry or equivocation that Shakespeare often explores in his soliloquies. I think Shakespeare's own perspective can be discerned in the deeply ironic prologue, as well as the general tone of that play, which undercuts and deglamorizes the legend of the Trojan War at every conceivable turn. So the prologue proclaims, the princes Orgulus, their high blood chafed. Orgulus is deliberately over-the-top diction, which sets up the bathetic anticlimax of chafed. And the same pattern of deflation holds throughout the prologue and indeed throughout the play. The ravished Helen, Menelaus' queen, with wanton Paris sleeps, and that's the quarrel. And quarrel here is a punchline. It's the end doesn't measure up to the means. Shakespeare's most extensive criticism of violence in the name of honor can be found, however, in his depiction of ancient Rome. In Coriolanus and Titus Andronicus, the imperatives of honor lead to an ongoing conflict between Rome and its neighbors, the Volscians and the Goths. In Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra, as well as Coriolanus, dissatisfaction with anything less than absolute imperium, that is, absolute individual command, leads to civil war within Rome itself. In Antony and Cleopatra, Enobarbus, for example, simply dismisses out of hand the very idea that Antony and Octavian might peacefully coexist. He says, world, thou hast a pair of chaps, no more. So two jaws, basically. And throw between them all the food thou hast. They'll grind the one the other. St. Augustine uses Rome's founders, the twins Romulus and Remus, as a paradigmatic example of the fratricide, which he sees at the heart of what he calls the earthly city or the city of man. Both desired to have the glory of founding the Roman Republic, but both could not have as much glory as if only one claimed it. For he who wished to have the glory of ruling would certainly rule less if his power were shared. And St. Augustine develops this critique of ancient Rome in his City of God. The state of Rome grew with amazing rapidity, he says, on account of its desire for glory and love of domination. Eventually, this vice, however, led Rome into interminable civil wars. And St. Augustine concludes, this craving for sovereignty, or libido dominandi, this lust for dominating, disturbs and consumes the human race with frightful ills. Taken holistically, in his retelling of the history of medieval England, as well as ancient Rome, Shakespeare presents something very like the problem of recurrent civil war, which St. Augustine emphasizes in his City of God. Secular civilization, as St. Augustine describes it, is by nature trapped in an incessant cycle of violence. Or as he says, the earthly city, the city of man, is divided against itself. We might compare Freud in his treatise, Civilization and Its Discontents. Homo homini lupus, man is a wolf to man. Since World War II, the development of international law was intended to bring peace to this earthly civilization. But the record since then of peaceful international cooperation has been mixed at best. The phrase forever war first came to prominence in the 1970s in connection with America's involvement in Vietnam. But the ongoing conflict in Afghanistan has proved even longer in duration, long enough for 2 generations of soldiers to have seen multiple tours of duty overseas. So there's been some articles in the American press about fathers and sons meeting in Afghanistan, both on tours of duty. St. Augustine would not be surprised by this situation, and I don't think Shakespeare would be either. In our post-lapsarian condition, St. Augustine would say, peace is a rare and precarious state, constantly reverting back to internecine conflict. War is the norm, not peace. We today tend to think peace is the norm and war is this strange thing that breaks out occasionally. Shakespeare and his contemporaries arguably saw things very differently. As Paul Jorgensen explains, in Shakespeare's usage, peace tends to describe a political condition, a social atmosphere, more troubling and more provocative of human drama than its customary associations of concord and tranquility. Peace tends to prevail as the play opens, usually in a decadent or unsound form. War, by contrast, comes almost always late in the play and comes as an agent of resolution rather than unrest. Working through a wide variety of contemporary sources, this is in an article called Shakespeare and the Uses of Peace, Jorgensen shows that this perspective, somewhat alien to us today, on the relative merits of peace and war was far from exceptional in Shakespeare's time. In thus giving peace a frequently ominous or unwholesome connotation, Shakespeare was but sharing with his countrymen a pessimism induced by current political writings and events. Now, Jorgensen hastens to add that, like most Elizabethans, and indeed like most human beings, Shakespeare did not like war. His point is rather that Shakespeare's fundamental vision of history is more Augustinian than utopian, or we might say more conservative than progressive. To put it in present-day parlance, Shakespeare is on the side of John Gray rather than Steven Pinker. Despite the so-called Whig vision of history, everything is not getting better all the time. So John Gray writes, liberal civilization is not the emerging meaning of the modern world, but a historical singularity that is inherently fragile. Now, John Gray's immediate or unspoken target in this is Francis Fukuyama. Gray writes, civilization is not the end point of modern history, but a succession of interludes in recurring spasms of barbarism. And so to explain, in his book, The End of History and the Last Man, written just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Fukuyama argues that we are approaching the end of history, in which liberal democracy is the only intellectual option that appears legitimate, having triumphed over erstwhile rivals such as hereditary monarchy, fascism, and communism. Since then, however, the rise of radical Islam, the suppression of the Green Revolution in Iran, the general failure of the Arab Spring, the ongoing anti-democratic Islamist turn in Turkish politics, and not least the revival of populism and nationalism in Europe, England, and the United States has, let's say, it has made things difficult for those who would defend Fukuyama's thesis. Even so, his more general sense of how history works, one that he derives from Hegel, does provide some useful insights into Shakespeare's keen awareness of the connection between war and concepts of honor. In brief, Fukuyama helpfully aligns 3 different ways of talking about more or less the same emotion. The part of Henry V that, as he says, leads him to covet honor is the same faculty of the soul that Plato describes as thumos, and which he personifies in his Republic as a dedicated military caste. Fukuyama defines it as man's sense of self-worth and the demand that he be recognized. And that last word, recognized, is especially important. It reflects Fukuyama's sense that what Shakespeare calls honor is a desire for what Hegel would call recognition, or Anerkennung. In keeping with Hegel and other latter-day Hegelians such as Charles Taylor and Axel Honneth, Fukuyama sees our desire to have our sense of ourselves acknowledged by other people as an innate, ineluctable and very powerful human drive. So for him, for these thinkers, the motor, the engine of history is our effort to validate our own self-esteem, or what Axel Honneth calls the struggle for recognition, and which he sees as more important than the social and economic conditions Marx calls relations of production. What most people want, more than any material sustenance, more than what Agamben calls bare life, is to feel respected. And this desire for recognition, or anerkennung, is or should be the bedrock, that is to say, the most fundamental ground of all historicist explanation of human conflict. In any case, if we take this point of view, then the desire for recognition cannot be eradicated from the human psyche. No one can be self-sufficient in satisfying that desire, not even Shakespeare's Coriolanus, despite his efforts to escape his need for that validation. We all want honor of one kind or another. So for Fukuyama, the key problem of politics is not to get rid of thumos altogether, but instead to channel that desire for honor in a direction that is as conducive as possible to peace. And to help explain what he means, Fukuyama invents two terms. Isothumia is the desire to be recognized as equal and is compatible with peaceful coexistence. Megalothumia is the desire to be recognized as superior and eventually, inevitably, leads to violence. For Fukuyama's doctoral supervisor, Samuel Huntington, the paradigmatic example of what Fukuyama would call a megalothumatic society in our own time is the Muslim world. So Huntington says, Islam has bloody borders. For Shakespeare, by contrast, as for St. Augustine, the paradigmatic example of a megalothumatic society is ancient Rome. And Fukuyama's neologism, megalothumia, is essentially interchangeable with St. Augustine's concept of libido dominandi, as well as Nietzsche's not unrelated concept of the will to power. So in his City of God, St. Augustine defends Christianity against pagan accusations that Christianity was the reason for the ongoing alarming collapse of the Roman Empire. So St. Augustine's writing the City of God as Vandals are taking over North Africa. As St. Augustine sees that decline, Rome fell prey to its own unreconstructed will to power. Rome was torn apart and fatally weakened by internecine civil wars. In his depiction of the Wars of the Roses, Shakespeare seems to set up a similar clash of possible interpretations. Why did England descend into civil war? And how does England pull itself back out of civil war? These are the questions Shakespeare's asking over the course of his history plays. And one answer, I think, can be found in the contrast between Henry V and his son and heir, Henry VI, the two kings who are at the center of Shakespeare's two tetralogies of English history plays. Of these two kings, Henry V tends to draw more attention. And in the last several decades in particular, stage productions of Henry V have tended to use the play as an occasion to agitate against Western military involvement overseas, casting Henry in an unflattering light. So for example, there were many productions that compared Henry V to George Bush and vice versa. If we want to understand Shakespeare's own perspective, however, I think that we need to hold off on criticism of Henry V unless we also address the manifest failure of his son, Henry VI, as well as the various mistakes of another peace-loving, pious, royal heir, Hamlet. Otherwise, we run the risk of blaming Henry V personally and beyond what he himself deserves for what Shakespeare sees instead as the imperfect, fallen nature of the world itself. So it's important, in other words, to read Henry V's social context, the political arena in which he exists, as if the evils of the world at large were somehow products of his character. So, for example, to back up for a second, like the common soldier Williams in Henry V, Shakespeare recognizes the terrible price of war. All those legs and arms and heads chopped off in a battle shall join together at the latter day and cry all, we died at such a place, some swearing, some crying for a surgeon, some upon their wives left poor behind them, some upon their children rawly left. Even so, I don't think that Shakespeare believes that non-violent diplomacy is always preferable to state-sponsored violence, even at such a cost of life and limb. And here we might cite the controversial figure Carl Schmitt. It would be a mistake to believe that a nation could eliminate the distinction of friend and enemy by declaring its friendship for the entire world, or by voluntarily disarming itself. The world will not thereby become depoliticized, and it will not be transplanted into a condition of pure morality, pure justice, or pure economics. Within the Christian tradition, it's not an exaggeration to say that secular government is sometimes represented as the special province of the devil. When Christ is tempted in the wilderness, Satan offers him as his own to give all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them. And it's in keeping with this vision that for St. Augustine, any post-lapsarian political order will inevitably fall short of the kingdom of heaven. Even at its best, for it to function at all, for it simply to exist, a secular state will require incessant, off-putting moral compromise. The measure to keep in mind is up from anarchy, Hobbes's war of all against all, rather than down from Kant's impossible perpetual peace. So in light of this kind of pessimistic Augustinian view of secular politics, Henry VI's efforts at diplomacy seem quixotic, and his abstemious aversion to any kind of violence comes across as short-sighted. His utopianism, although well-meaning, is fundamentally and finally inadequate to the task of maintaining a viable peace. So for example, in the third of Shakespeare's plays about Henry VI, as Lord Clifford dies of wounds sustained in combat, he lays the blame for England's civil war squarely on the childlike shoulders of its mild-mannered king, Henry VI. Clifford says, Henry, hadst thou swayed as kings should do, or as thy father and his father did, giving no ground unto the house of York, they never had then sprung like summer flies. I and 10,000 in this luckless realm had left no mourning widows for our death. Shakespeare depicts the reign of Henry VI, in other words, in much the same way that unsympathetic historians of American foreign policy now tend to describe the presidency of Jimmy Carter back in the 70s and more recently, the foreign policy of President Barack Obama. Pious, progressive naivete about human rights and international norms, emerging out of an over-optimistic secularization of Christian principles, finds itself caught off guard in the end by ruthless Russian or Iranian or Chinese realpolitik. And so like the idea being that like these idealistic American presidents, Henry VI makes a category error. He treats the city of man as if it were the city of God, and as a result, it blows up in his face. As the American founding father James Madison observed in his explanation of the rationale behind the American Constitution, what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Sorry. So, in his account of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, Edward Gibbon imagines the contempt and the reproaches of the pagans who asked, what is to be the fate of the empire, attacked on every side by barbarians, if all mankind should adopt the cowardly sentiments of this new sect, the Christians? So we today tend to be concerned about the danger of what Fukuyama calls megalothumia, the kind of desire for honor that we see writ large in the figure of Henry V. But it's possible, however, to see concern in the political implications of its polar opposite, a timid and retiring mikrothumia. That is to say, what happens if an individual or a nation lacks the thumos, the desire for honor, necessary for effective self-defense? And we see this in Hamlet. I am pigeon-livered, he complains, and lack gall to make oppression bitter. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle criticizes what he calls mikropsychia, or smallness of soul. And in his Moralia, Plutarch introduces a parallel concept, dysopia, literally lack of inner resources. We might call it fecklessness. You know, it's an inability to stand up for oneself, a temperamental failure to fight rather than concede. This charge of dysopia or fecklessness seems fitting for Henry VI, and it proves just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, in Shakespeare's account, as Henry VI war to win back English territory in France. So, by his account, a refusal to engage in power politics creates a power vacuum, which is not necessarily an improvement. And here we might look to present-day Iraq or Syria or Libya. In Shakespeare's first tetralogy, the chaos which Henry VI allows to consume the nation leads in time, and not by chance, to the rise of genuinely frightening figures such as Richard III. And it's fair to say that Fukuyama, at the end of his account of the end of history, does worry that efforts to excise all interest in military engagement from the moral universe of liberal democracies will leave them defenseless in the end against abiding enemies. The last men of history, he says, will not survive if they allow themselves to become men without chests. And here he's citing Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Thus you stick out your chests, but alas, they are hollow. And so, I suppose to conclude in a way, you know, we want to ask, is Henry a good guy or a bad guy? Is he a hero or a villain? By this, we typically mean, is he a pacifist or a progressive? Is he a progressive? Stephen Marks argues that Shakespeare changes his mind. He starts out pro-war and ends up anti-war. But I think it's possible to discern a consistent compromise position running throughout all of Shakespeare's plays, analogous to what we now call just war theory. This reconciliation of the real and the ideal is grounded in the Christian doctrine of the fall of man, as well as Aristotle's sense of ethics as inherently and at best only approximate and circumstantial. So according to this perspective, which in Shakespeare's context would have been the norm, war is at times a necessary evil, the least worst solution, given the fallenness of human nature. And let me see. Should I stop there or should I talk about equity?
I think we're gonna have to. You're gonna have.
Yeah, I'll stop there. I'll stop there. That's good. I can answer questions. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, sure. We can carry on actually, and it's going to bleed in the Q&A, and because I already have questions.
Yeah, sure. I'll stop there. Yeah, yeah.
So thank you very much, Patrick, and Jeanne. It's up to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm sure we'll continue this very stimulating conversation with the questions. So thanks a lot. Do we have questions here? Anything that you want to go back to?
And actually, just a quick, can you hear?
I may have a question for you, Louise. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Yes.
I don't see you very well. Oh, there.
Yeah. So Louise is here. Jeanne, are you here? I think we lost Jeanne momentarily. So I'm actually.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. No pun intended. Okay, go for it.
Oops, no, we've lost her.
No, I think we lost her. It's just coming back and on what you were saying, that actually Henry is more of a player somehow. And would you say that basically all this metaphor of the game helps reworking completely the figure of the hero and undermining this the debate on Henry's heroism at the very heart of a play that is supposed to celebrate him?
Yes, I think it does. I think it makes him perhaps into a more Machiavellian figure rather than chivalric hero, definitely. I don't know if that answers your question entirely.
And how does the how much do you think that the metaphor of games and the use of game transformed the play? From a sort of the usual mirror for princes and the usual Decasibus tragedy?
I think it transforms it because it's well, it can be read in two ways, either in a very satirical way or in a more pragmatic way, as I tried to analyze in Henry's lines. The other thing I thought was interesting was that it's I think that there is a form of a study of how these metaphors are used, and they're still quite present in historical narratives today. It's still very common to use games to dramatize history, and the fact that we find this in a play with games of chances is, I think, also a way to dramatize history, but choosing chance is perhaps much more ambiguous than choosing chess, for instance, or something like that.
Thank you. Jeanne, you wanted to say something, but we need your mic. Yeah.
I'm back. Sorry about that. Maybe, yes, Louise, can you explore the link between games and honor? So Patrick talked about honor, and can we link your two papers? So I don't know. After his victory, Henry praises God. So he says that he owes his victory to God. So that's what you said. But at the same time, in Act 14:3, he says that if it be a sin to covet honor, I am the most offending soul alive. So that, I don't know, that's something that you can say about that.
I think there's a definite link to honor in that he portrays himself as a very daring player. The French, on the other hand, when we see the French arguing about war, they're very defensive. They're much more cautious in their game. They say that they have to double their defense, even if they already outnumber the English. Henry, on the other hand, is careful to show that he's a daring player by contrast. So I think that might link it to the theme of honor as well.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you very much. I think that's a question.
I was going to chime in for Louise's paper. I was struck that Antony and Octavian, I think, play at dice, and Antony complains about how he keeps losing, which is, again, I think would be in keeping with this idea of dice as a symbol for who has the kind of power of God or the power of fate behind them in some way.
Absolutely, yeah. And he also mentions that his cocks are losing in cockfighting matches.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah.
Jean-Christophe?
Yes, I had a question for Patrick. I wondered how diplomacy featured in your framework. I'm thinking in particular of a statement made a while ago by the the head of the British Secret Service, who actually said herself that all means of all military means of fighting Al-Qaeda had failed, and that the only means really were diplomatic means, and that of course the states wouldn't hear that, because the state is for political reasons has to appear as active and as maybe revengeful in a way. So I was curious to ask you about whether diplomacy has any place in the framework that you are that you presented to us.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, so I would hesitate. I would hasten to clarify at the beginning that what I think about these things, I see as not necessarily always corresponding to what Shakespeare thinks about them. And so, so I think diplomacy presupposes a good faith on the part of the interlocutor, that they are willing to be persuaded or to be changed. And so, you know, I said that for Shakespeare, the analog of the way we think about, or the way some thinkers think about Muslim civilization today would be ancient Rome. That is, he sees it as a sort of honor culture. Whether or not that's true of Muslim civilization today is a separate question. I'm just saying Shakespeare sees ancient Rome the way, say, Samuel Huntington sees Muslim civilization. And so I think Shakespeare would worry about the danger of diplomacy being used to inculcate weakness. And an example might be the way in which Brutus's well-meaning, idealistic diplomatic overture to Antony, yes, Antony, please come speak at the funeral oration for Caesar, backfires on him. And Cassius sort of knows that it will. You know, Cassius, are you sure you want to let Antony speak here? So I think Shakespeare is aware of the ways in which engaging in diplomacy can be a danger as well as a possible asset.
But won't violence lead to further violence? I mean, there is in a history of counterterrorism, there are examples, you know, of very strong movements such as, you know, Sinn Féin that was eventually brought to the table. I'm not saying that it's easy, but all from a historical point of view, all terrorist conflicts have been have either petered off or they've I mean, people have been brought to the negotiation table. So isn't that a point that I know you're focused on Shakespeare, but isn't that a broader point to consider?
Yes, I mean, I think I suppose my way of thinking about this is one of the things I'm very interested in, the ways in which Shakespeare does not necessarily correspond to the beliefs and conclusions of the present day sort of educated class that tends to study Shakespeare. So we tend to have one set of assumptions about human nature, war and peace, governance. I think often Shakespeare doesn't share those assumptions and can be kind of alien to us, more alien than we give him credit for. And I think part of the value of studying Shakespeare is not to find confirmation of the way that we think, but instead partly to find an articulation of a vision that is shared by a large part of the country, not typically the part of the, or of in France, in England, in America, you know, the kind of person who, like the conservative part, who would vote for Trump or who would vote for Brexit, who would be nationalistic, that is at play at times in Shakespeare, and that he can help us to understand that point of view in a way that can be discomforting for us. And I think so. And I think the value there is to try to ease the breakdown between these two halves of the society, which has become very polarized. But you know, and I think the temptation for us is to want Shakespeare to agree with us about things like this, and I'm not sure that he does. I mean, the rebellions, for example, in the history plays, they're put down with violence. That is, you know, Henry VI tries to solve them through diplomacy and fails, and I think that's very uncomfortable for us.
Could I just come back on that thing on diplomacy? And actually, it's just that is associated with weakness. And actually, in Henry V, it's a bit ambiguous whether it's associated with weakness or not. It's associated with making mistakes, clearly mishandling sometimes, not so much diplomatic speech, but actually not basing one's speech on facts. That's the problem of the French ambassador and the Dauphin when he sends the first gift, which is historically it's inaccurate anyway, but for the sake of the dramatic argument, so let's focus on that gift. And it's based on the wrong facts. That's why it's going to fail. And there's an interesting moment where the constable and where the French are arguing, and they're at court, and the Dauphin is being this Dauphin self, his very tyrannical self, and excessive. And the constable of France is actually embarking on reported speech moment, because what he's doing, he's actually quoting almost, he's doing a verbatim report of what the ambassador said when he came back. And he's trying actually to counter the argument and to sort of not purge, but purge the tyranny of the Dauphin. So here, diplomacy is not seen as weak, but as a way actually of being a sort of counter voice to an excessive executive, or when the executive is going wrong. And in that way, it's an argument, even if actually the ambassador himself wouldn't have been able to do such a thing at the time. What is interesting is that the tradition for the practice of having a reported narrative by an ambassador, because those kind of reported voices had an interplay by someone who was a courtier, maybe higher in the pecking order, which transformed diplomacy in not an art of weakness, but actually it's just not an art of resistance, but of sometimes constructive debate. May fail as much as it succeeds. Shakespeare shows a diplomacy of war that succeeds with Exeter, and the failure of the French diplomacy because it's not based on facts. And but at the same time, it doesn't discard diplomacy totally as being entirely useless. It's just being realistic. Would you say he's a realist?
Well, I think the episode where the messenger is tempering the message of the Dauphin could be interestingly juxtaposed with Prince John's diplomacy with the rebels. Jane Wong has an interesting essay where she says there are parallels there to the way in which the separation between the diplomat and the central authority was used to trick the Irish into taking on basically into allowing themselves to be captured at particular key battles. So I don't think Shakespeare is dismissive of diplomacy altogether. I just think I'll put it this way. I remember when I was teaching Shakespeare at Yale, the undergraduates had this visceral sense that any resort to violence was always inherently not only morally worse, but practically wrong. Like that surely the practically superior solution was always to use words and diplomacy. No, I don't think Shakespeare or his contemporaries would agree with that.
He doesn't do it because the proof is Exeter, who's the soldier, and it's interesting in a lot. You were mentioning a lot of the stage adaptation, or my memory is that of Branagh when you see Brian Blessed with his just weight coming into his armor, and he comes here the courts of France, and you can hear the noise. It's just he's overwhelmingly bringing the battlefield onto the diplomatic field, and it's a diplomacy of war, and he's successful. He sets the terms and conditions. It's just it's a sort of a one-sided negotiation. Somebody else is trying to do that in Brussels at the moment. Apparently it's not successful, and it's so indeed he's presenting different types of diplomacy, and maybe sometimes the problem is that you're right, it's seen through the maybe a bias that says that diplomacy is one thing only and in one context.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Shakespeare generally has a more pessimistic view of human nature than I think a lot of progressive, academic, well-educated people today tend to have.
Or is it just a realist? Is it really pessimistic, or is it just? But that's probably another debate.
Yeah. I mean, there's shades of this, you know. I mean, yeah, that's a well. So here you might contrast what I'm saying to someone like Kieran Ryan. You know, Kieran Ryan really wants to see these moments of utopian vision in Shakespeare, of visions of a possible peace that might emerge. And I would say, well, I think Shakespeare does see that, but he sees that as an impossibility in this life, or sort of before the second coming of Christ. That this, and I guess as Jean-Christophe was talking about, doesn't violence beget more violence? And in a way, that's true. I think the question would be, would Shakespeare and his contemporaries, given a kind of Christian or Augustinian view of human nature, do they think it's possible to escape that? There's a sense that there's always going to be violence, and the best that we can hope for is to it's like when Henry IV tells Henry V, make your wars abroad rather than at home. The idea that there's not going to be any wars doesn't even enter the equation, in a way that I think is very alien to how we think. And so that I'm interested in trying to, maybe that's not Shakespeare's own perspective, maybe it is, but I'm interested in trying to recover what it would be like to think that way.
I see what I mean. It's, sorry to barge into the conversation. There is just one question in the chat, actually, it could actually both interest Louise and you. It's just the vision of equality in the play. And so we're on the sort of the, not to quote the current discussions on the leveling the playing fields or something like that, but it's just equality in the face of the odds. And you were talking, Louisa, of the winning against all odds, and the vision of equality in this play. So if both of you have ideas on that.
Louise, do you want to go?
I'm just thinking of that passage in the play where he talks of the even play of battle. Seems to suggest that, or in a way, is a field word to, well, yeah, but they're not truly equal then. No, I'd have to think a bit more about this. I'm sorry.
Are they on an equal equality as basically, are they really on an equal ground? Are the gamesters on equal in terms of the weaponry and the capacity? Is it really a sort of shock of the titans kind of thing? And that's why somehow there is still an odd there, because they will be stakeholders who are big enough in front of each other to let's say to make the gamble interesting, to make the game interesting, because we really don't know who's supposed to win. Is there that notion? Do you think there's that notion, or is it not at all there?
I think that could be. I think it's possible. I think possibly that's what's meant with this expression, the even play of battle, and the idea perhaps that as long as the battle hasn't ended, you're not sure that the day is yours, and something unexpected might still happen. So perhaps that could enter in that perspective.
Was just relaying that question, Patrick. Do you have, or anyone?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very interesting question, as Louise points up, in Shakespeare's time of whether such a thing as chance exists. You know, to a certain Christian understanding, there is no such thing as chance or fortune. There is only the will of God, the will of angels and demons, and the will of human beings. So to ascribe to any things that seem like chance or fortune aren't really. And I think Shakespeare is aware of that way of thinking about the world, but maybe not entirely sold on it. I don't know. The the topic of equality interests me from another perspective as well, which was the question that was asked earlier about comparing and contrasting Henry V and Julius Caesar. So, and I think one way to think about those two plays has to do with Shakespeare and republicanism and the idea, like, does a country need a king? And more generally, does a society need what Ulysses calls degree or hierarchy? And I, much in contrast to Chris Fitter, for example, I tend to think that Shakespeare does believe that a country benefits from hierarchy and degree culminating in a king. We see the way in which the name of Henry V settles the rebellion in the second part of Henry VI. I suppose, whereas in Julius Caesar, up until they kill Caesar, it seems like such a good idea to kill him. But then after they do, everything falls apart, you know, in the same way that things fall apart when Henry VI proves sort of ineffectual in his role as king. I think Shakespeare is not as egalitarian in his sensibility. Although it's interesting, nowadays, we have a revival of populism. I think Shakespeare is an anti-populist. Like, in that sense, perhaps he's more like a lot of elites today.
That's and sometimes used by another elite, actually, as a fantastic but negative instrument of soft power. I'm thinking about the Great Britain campaign, and in terms of soft power, it's really interesting how they misuse Shakespeare. And sometimes you would say, just leave the man alone. It's interesting, basically, how the material can be polarized, and how this particular play is actually always coming back as this in the political debate, whereas it goes from war to international relations to philosophy, actually, and it's eminently reversible, which is probably what he wants. So I think it's going to be time for us to interrupt the live stream, so we can say goodbye to our audience. You can wave goodbye to our audience.
Thank you.